All right. So first of all, so we're live now. So what do you prefer to go by?
Ryan's fine.
Ryan's fine. All right.
Yeah.
So Ryan, you mentioned on Twitter that you had some some interesting things to talk about regarding this last election, and I had some questions for you as well because we were part of a debate
hmm
not too long ago, and we didn't really have a chance to get really deep into the meat of legal and political philosophy. But I saw some hints that perhaps you had some good based opinions, and so there's a couple things I wanted to go through. Let's just start with the first one. What are your thoughts on the last election? Donald Trump, did you vote for him? If you did, do you
Yeah.
regret it already, or do you think it's was a good idea, or what do you think?
So where we left it, I don't know. You changed your position and came out formally for Trump after we spoke, which is part of why I wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
When we last were speaking, we were both, I would say, undecided and probably unlikely voters at that point. Though, if I were going to vote, it would have been more likely for him than not. But that's where I remained. So I was amongst the, I don't know, 10, 20 million people who had the enthusiasm gap in the Democratic Party because I'm a historically strong left voter. So I was a Democrat through my entire life. I only really started getting exposed to what I would call like intellectually sound version of conservative ideas in law school. Before that, I was kind of like fully bubble mode, and I hadn't even heard the good arguments. Um, Post law school, I've left the Democratic Party and am now registered independent, but I've actually never voted conservative. That said, I'm an originalist and a federalist, so it's a little bit of a transition background for me. And yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was how you overcame your reservations about him, which I think, if I understood you correctly, were similar to mine. I would say more personal than directional. Like the kind of like the targets he's aiming at are targets that, with some, we can. There might be some quibbles, but by and large, the targets are good targets. But the question was like, is this the guy? Is this the guy that I can trust to do it? Is this a guy I can trust with power? And kind of those questions were kind of what left me indecisive.
Okay, so for you, it was more of a personal thing than a directional thing, would you say?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I think like I one of my big things, and I'm sure this will come up in this conversation, is that I think systems and structures are how humans overcome their terrible, terrible selfishness and flaws and biases. And that doesn't mean the systems are intrinsically good. They might fail. They might need to be revitalized. They might need to be torn down and rebuilt. But I'm inherently suspicious of when people are talking about pulling away guardrails. I I like the filibuster. I don't like court packing. So Donald Trump is, amongst his other qualities, a habitual guardrail abuser, and that's a difficult pill for me to swallow.
That's okay. So that's fair, and I do think you're coming at all of this from a very reasonable position, and I think yeah, even if you don't fundamentally agree with me at the end of the day as to what led me to
Mhm.
vote for Trump, perhaps you can understand my motivations. So, and so just so I'm 100% clear, you didn't vote at all this last election.
No,
You said this one out. Okay.
I was. I mean, yeah, we don't need to get into local stuff. That doesn't really. But yeah, on the presidential level, I sat this one out.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, I think the when people ask about it, the thing I typically say is something along the lines of, both sides ran a terrible campaign. The shame is only one could lose. And I think he ran a better campaign than she did, and he deserved to win in the sense that she really deserved to lose,
Yeah.
but it wasn't. I don't think that he ran the type of campaign that would have had I'm not sure he could have replicated that success, that level of success against a stronger candidate. Is I guess what I'm saying. Like she was hugely flawed by the standards of what works on the left, in my opinion.
I do think about this sometimes. Like, I don't know how well Trump. There's a few members, potential opposition that I do wonder, could that have changed things? Now, my initial feeling was, I think that if she picked Shapiro, her position in Pennsylvania would have been much stronger. But as it turns out, that wasn't the linchpin state. I thought it was going to be. I very strongly thought it was going to be, but it really was, even if he had lost Pennsylvania, he still would have won the election. I think perhaps the history that you have is I share somewhat. I voted for Bernie Sanders back in 2016 in the primary, and then in the general, I voted for the Gary Johnson, right, the Libertarian candidate. And so I always vote, but sometimes it's third party, and that's also what happened in 2020, right? 2020 came around. I didn't vote for Trump or Biden. I voted for Joe Jorgensen. And that's because I think libertarianism really exemplifies my political belief set. Now, for me, coming up in this election, I think that, the big things for me that I was concerned about, because since 2020 and now, I had, I had been out of law school, been practicing for, I've been practicing for some years now, and constantly learning about the philosophy and the system, and having a lot of discussions, and having even that just the preparation for having debates. You take a lot of effort to look into things and to educate yourself on perhaps things that you didn't in law school. I mean, to be honest, and one of those was, I think, originalism and how important it is. And so if there was one thing I think that pushed me over the line in saying, you know what, I'm not going to vote for the third party this time. I live in a swing state, right? My vote actually sort of matters. It was the court. It was the idea that, the president's going to be in power for 4 years, but the composition of the court can go for much longer than that. And the philosophy that the justices have on the court matters a lot when we're talking about just the consistency of the process, but also, I think, the rule of law. I've made, it sounds like an edgy comment a few times. I've made the comment, I think originalists are the only ones that really believe in a coherent rule of law. And I'll stand by that. I guess, let me ask you this. If you were going to vote for Trump in the last election, would it have been originalism and the fact that he's picking justices off the Federalist Society's shortlist, right? Is that would that be the linchpin? Was it just not enough?
That would be a huge piece of it. The other piece of it would be that, quite frankly, we don't need to go into this because it's just such a breathtakingly obvious point, but the Democrats' border policy has been so politically motivated and unhinged and kind of disconnected from any actual intent. Like, there's just no policy position there. It was just, we're going to do the opposite of what Trump did until it starts hurting us, and then we're going to do the exact same thing that Trump did, which is just like, well, you're just nakedly playing politics with the border, which I don't love. But yeah, I mean, I think that would have been a huge part of it. Would have been court appointments, and I mean, originalism. When I try to explain it to people who are non-lawyers, the thing I tend to say is, originalism is the only constitutional theory that would give you a reason to do something you don't want to do. Like, you could look at a text and say, I, pretending I'm a justice, would prefer outcome A, but originalism demands outcome B.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a living constitutionalist, it's like, oh, what a wonderful day you have. Every day you're interpreting the Constitution. You say, God, I really think the First Amendment should mean this. And then you read it and you say, what a surprise, it does. That's just not, there's no guardrails there. And I think originalism is the only judicial philosophy, and I don't think anyone says it's perfect, but it's the only judicial philosophy that attempts to keep judges within their proper role. And what I was saying earlier in the conversation plays a huge part in this, where I don't. Judges are humans and are flawed and are biased, and the only way that they can do their job is to be structurally confined to legal reasoning and to be doing lawyers' work. When you ask them to make policy decisions and just kind of rule on what they think the Constitution ought to say, you're asking them to be kings. That's just not what judges do.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, 100%. Though the one issue that I run into the most when I'm trying to explain originalism, usually right before I have to explain originalism, the question is like, do you think that Roe versus Wade should have been overturned? And my answer is yes, right, every time, because I think it was obviously politically motivated law, and I'll defend the Dobbs case and not being that. Now, I guess in terms of and oftentimes this is very unsuccessful because a lot of people aren't particularly interested in why Roe versus Wade was bad law or that it was should have been overturned or not, but more just along the lines of this is an attack on what's perceived to be a right, the abortion rights in the country. I mean, when you go about explaining originalism in that kind of context, right, defend or criticizing cases like Roe versus Wade, I mean, how do you go about it in those kind of situations?
I think it's about asking what it is you think a judge or a lawyer does. And well, the answer is they interpret legal documents. The Constitution is a legal document. So what it means is what it was understood to mean when it was enacted. It can't mean anything else for the same reason that, if you sign a contract and 5 years later you're suing somebody because they breached the contract and you go to court and the judge says, well, yeah, everyone agreed to that, but don't we today think that's not fair? Don't we today think that we understand better what you wanted 5 years ago? Let's just reinterpret the whole thing. That can't be how law works. Law is about precise language and interpreting what that language means. And the structure of the Constitution gives ample power the other branches to enact policy. And those are the branches that are empowered to do it and the branches that should do it. Just because something is a good idea doesn't mean the Constitution requires it. And just because something is a bad idea doesn't mean the Constitution prevents it. The Constitution can't be interpreted that way. Otherwise, you're elevating judges into kings and worse. And this is a tough point to land with people who haven't thought about the issue much. But and this is what essentially Roe did. You politicize the bench in a way that's tough to reverse. Because if your only criteria for a judge is whether they do what you want them to do, you are treating them like a senator. That's how you evaluate a member of Congress. Did they pass the law I wanted? But for a judge, they must be doing something called legal reasoning. And they apply legal reasoning to the text. And if the outcome of that isn't what you like, that's too bad. But you want them because they're good at legal reasoning and they do it well. And if you're asking them, if it's outcome determinative, if you're saying, well, the judges I support are the ones that interpret things the way I like, you're no longer treating them like a judge. And if you do that long enough, I think you're right, you will have a rule of law problem. Because why would anyone trust that the law is worth a damn if it's just politically motivated backwards reasoning?
Yeah. So I guess this leads to give me 1 second real quick.
No problem.
I think this leads to one of the, I guess, fundamental questions that was leading up to this past election, because a lot of people were questioning. I thought I laid out my arguments, in that big post that got picked up by a few, I guess, bigger names, mostly criticizing me. But of course, that's just how Twitter goes.
Yeah, I think I know some of the people you're referring to.
Yeah.
We can maybe circle back to that.
Why? Yeah, I think we're almost entirely aligned when it comes to the concept of originalism. And so, when I say, look, the president's going to be the president for 4 years, but the court's going to be potentially for the next 20, 25 years. Why for you wasn't that enough, I guess, to push you over the edge and say, look, I mean, do you think that Trump posed, and I guess poses, a threat within these 4 years to the guardrails that you're referring to, more
Yes.
so than okay?
I think I'm not. I don't necessarily mean more so. I don't know that I would weigh it more strongly than the threat posed by, for example, the Democrats who refuse to rule out court packing, or seem posed to break the filibuster. Like those are, in my mind, also threats. Um, the threat that Trump poses is odd because I was explaining to a friend of mine who was kind of aghast that I didn't um, vote the way he voted. And what I was trying to say is, I have not drunk the Kool Aid on Trump becoming a dictator in that I don't think that's a high probability event. But given his personality, it's not one that I can completely rule out, which is like, it's an odd thing. Like I would say that with Harris, if I voted for Harris, I would say there, and she won, I'd say there would be a very high probability she would do things that I thought were bad for the country and for the stability of the government. With Trump, I think there's a low probability that he'll do something really catastrophic, like really outrageously stupid, like impose global tariffs on everyone, like he's saying. Now, do I think that's more of a negotiation tactic? Yeah. But is it possible that he thinks that's a good idea? Yeah, it is. And he's hard to get a read on, and that's part of his negotiating shtick. But it meant that I when I'm doing kind of like almost like for people who went to law school in the audience, a tort calculation about like whether something's a reasonable precaution. He had, for him, it was a low probability of a catastrophic event, which makes it hard to weigh other factors and kind of leads to a bit of confusion. I think he did really well though in the last week. I mean, when I was looking at the Joe Rogan interview in particular,
Yeah.
he had this offhand comment, and you can only use your own barometer, but he said, if I win, this is my last election. And that's actually quite meaningful because it was offhand. It rang true to me. I didn't think he was spinning any falsehoods. And if you believe that, then the only way that these problems come up is if he like pauses all elections forever, which I don't think is likely. But there was that kind of looming January 6th of it all with him. That is, and when I say January 6th, I should be clear. I'm not really referring to the riot, which concerns me less than like the Georgia call
Sure.
and some of the like the false slates of electors, which were more guardrail attacks in my mind than the riot was.
Yeah. I think that perhaps both of us are, and this is probably just due to the way we think or how we're, I guess, tortured into thinking by 3 years of
Mhm.
uh, evil
Yeah.
debauchery. We're both doing some kind of calculus, some kind of tort calculus here, and trying to come out to what is the best, or I guess the least bad conclusion. Because I think whenever you make a pragmatic political decision, you're obviously not getting everything that you want. If I got what I want, there'd be very different people in power right now. It wouldn't be Trump, and it wouldn't be, I mean, it's not going to be Trump, and it wouldn't be Biden, and Kamala Harris wouldn't be a possibility either. Um, I'm with you in that the January 6th stuff was concerning, and
Mhm.
I'm with you in the sense that I haven't, I think that I'm not particularly concerned about the riot, and I do think that is a riot, and I think that the reason people are fixating on that as the question of insurrection is because historically insurrections tend to require an element of violence. And so that was sort of, and they're looking when they're going after Trump, they're looking very specifically to attach the word insurrection to him because that has legal implications, right? They were looking for that specific word, but you don't have to attach that specific word to have criticisms over what happened. Not about again the violence that did happen, which I think was which was a riot, and I think it was something that I don't think Donald Trump directly was like morally or legally responsible for. But the I have some concerns about the Eastman memo and specifically the sort of idea of Pence, you can go ahead and do this, right? Even if by the way, which I would assume the Supreme Court rule against him. Hopefully, I would assume so. But even if they did, that's still concerning. But let's say they didn't rule against him. Let's say it turned out the whole thing was legal. That still bothers me. It still bothers me because it feels like, these guardrails don't much like we were talking about the court packing, for example. These guardrails, there is guardrails that, and also the filibuster. There's guardrails that exist that aren't necessarily set in legal stone, but are sort of implicit in the functioning of America. And the idea of we set up these rules for the election, and if these conditions are satisfied, now you become the president. Biden fulfilled that. He did. He fulfilled the win conditions. And the fact that he fulfilled the win conditions, and the question is, well, we want to undo these win conditions, that's concerning. So I'm with you in the sense that I think there was concern there. My perception of this, though, is the fact that they couldn't even get off the ground with step one of like getting Pence to go along with it, to me, in that tort calculation, makes the whole thing rank as, I think, extraordinarily unlikely to have ever actually posed a serious threat to American democracy, because that was step one. You get Mike Pence involved, and then you got to get Congress involved, and then it's got to pass Supreme Court muster, right? It's got to pass all these different obstacles that I just don't think you're able to get past. But something that I am concerned about, and this might actually, I think, get past the first couple steps, would be situations like packing the court, or much more likely putting justices on the Supreme Court that are non-originalist, specifically ones that will simply back whatever political ideology that they happen to personally feel. And I think that these are also these sort of non-legal guardrail violations, right? These, you're still deviating from what I think the intended purpose of the Supreme Court is, in securing the stability of our country. And so for me, that's a bigger concern than it is than January 6th was, even though I'm not saying that January 6th wasn't a concern, if that makes sense.
So do you mean like a bigger concern once you weigh the probability and the risk?
Yeah.
Or do you mean, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, we were approaching it with a similar idea in mind. All the things you said about, the slate of electors and the ask of Mike Pence, and even like, while I would not be someone who would call the events of January 6th, I haven't looked at the question deeply, but I would be probably more in favor of using the term riot than anything else.
Me as well.
It wasn't a riot that he quelled quickly, and he had options. So like that's less serious to me than the elector issue, but it's not a ringing endorsement in his favor. So the question is that the sort of person you want to have this level of power? And if I was going to zoom out for a little bit, I voted for Biden, and the reason I did, and this will explain to you maybe where I'm coming from, and also why my level of disappointment in the Democratic Party was so extreme, that despite my problems with Trump, I was actually more upset with them on many levels. I voted for Biden on the implicit promise that he was going to go into office as a one-term president, and as a one-term president who was not running for re-election, would be the uniquely situated in my lifetime to be the adult in the room and start doing things like, for example, I've grown up through 9/11 and endless strings of emergencies. And every 4 to 8 years, there's a new emergency, and the reaction to every emergency is to expand executive power. Yeah. To the point where we now have a president that is so powerful that it really is concerning when you vote for president. Like they have so much power, in my mind, power well beyond what the Constitution intended for them to have. And Biden, I thought, hey, this is a guy who could actually walk it back. He could say, you know what, I'm gonna undo some of these things that happened during the Obama years, during the Bush years, during the Trump years that expanded this power. But he did obviously the absolute opposite. Like he blew a hole in executive power and all the guardrails associated with it, or at least attempted to.
The
Thankfully, the
OSHA
court.
attempt was wild.
Oh my! Um, the vaccine mandate, and for the record, I am vaccinated. So like this is again like we're talking about originalism.
Yeah.
This is not an issue that offends me because it affected me. This is an issue that offends me because the idea that the executive could unilaterally impose a vaccine mandate on essentially half the country
Yeah.
with the stroke of a pen, with over Congress's objection,
Yeah.
is insane. Like that, like I mean, you can get into the legal niceties of that, but you don't have to. Like just on a first principles, what does the Constitution say? That's insane. That was the first time I've ever considered like quitting my firm gig and being like, is there like an impact litigation group I could join? Because this is that really bothered me. So yeah, that's the calculus. Is that I don't think that was a misfire. I think that's the core identity of the Democratic establishment. And Kamala ran essentially as the open mouthpiece of the Democratic establishment. It was very clear that she was going to do whatever the party wanted to do and that she was willing to reverse whatever position she had previously held. So there's no reason for me to think that she wouldn't continue that trend. And that's wildly unacceptable. So, I mean, it was a obvious no for that reason. And yeah, and I just couldn't quite. I tried to get myself into a place where I could get comfortable with Trump, but in the ultimate analysis, couldn't. But I felt like I don't see where you're coming from. Like it was. I think we were kind of having the same inner monologue in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, because again, this was my first time voting for Trump, so obviously, I've had apprehensions, right? It's not
Mhm.
like some people, and I guess power to you. There's people who Trump announced he was running, and he started picking up steam, and they went full on.
Mhm.
They love this guy, and they have no real objections to whatever he does. But I was never really part of that camp. Again, right? The big concerns for me. And one of the reasons why I voted for Bernie in 2016, I was concerned about things like war. Um, I was concerned about things like personal liberty, and things of that nature that appeal to me. And this time around, I think that the Republican Party, it's specifically Trump, I think has done a lot to moderate the Republicans' image of the historical image, I think, of not caring about those things, right? So yes, originalism was, I think, the key part for me. And I even said, if tomorrow Trump comes out and says the Federalist Society, they were great and everything, but we're gonna leave them, aside, and we're gonna start going with some, pro MAGA judges. Well, I mean, now we got now we got a problem, and that would, I think, decide my vote. That one statement would decide my vote. But it was the fact that he didn't do that, and historically he's picked, I think, very good justices from the Federalist Society shortlist, combined with the fact that I think this time he ran was much less of a hawkish campaign
Mhm.
compared to Republicans past, even compared to Trump past. You have people like, I don't know what you think about her. I personally like her. People like Tulsi Gabbard, who is on
Mhm.
the cabinet, or going to be potentially on the cabinet, who really was the kind of the voice of anti-hawkishness back, going back a long time. And so the fact, and she's not the only one. So the fact that you have a couple, less hawkish stances on things, that was another thing that really appealed to me about Trump, at least compared to Kamala. And I guess do you think that I'm misguided on that point? I mean, what are your thoughts on, I guess, hawkishness, geopolitical concerns, that kind of element of the Trump campaign?
I mean, it seemed like it seemed like more of a wash to me. And the reason it did is that, well, maybe not a total wash, but it at the maximum level of generality, I think he's probably not going to be as helpful in Ukraine as the Democrats would have been, and will be more helpful in Israel than the Democrats would have been. And I'm in the I, I guess I'm in the minority on this, but I don't view those as as fundamentally distinct conflicts in the way that some people do. I think that there is the projection of Western power into the world, which the United States, and Trump points this out, subsidizes. That's what we do. We pay for it. But the Western power is projected, and it's being undermined, and it's being undermined by the usual suspects in some sense, but the usual suspects, it's not like they don't have their own alliances and their own goals. So it sounds like I'm probably a touch more hawkish on Ukraine than
Sure.
you are.
Probably.
I don't think, I don't think it's likely that you're getting the land back. So at this point, like the end of the conflict may require just giving up territory. But I had an experience in law school. Actually, we were doing international law, and we were talking about a kind of guest lecturer came in, and he was talking about like Russian jurisprudence and particularly Russian views of international law. And they were saying like it's all for them. It's not what it says. It's the practice. So if the practice is that Russia can have wars of territorial expansion that don't really go punished, then that is what international law permits. And we've seen Russia expand now through territorial aggression twice. That needs to stop happening. Now, the good news is, I think Trump is a more credible negotiator. I think that he has mastered the art of being tough to pin down. And so when he comes in and makes a threat, it's very hard to rule that out. It's the same problem I have with him. Like, I'm like, well, is he going to suspend the Constitution? I don't think so. I don't think he meant that literally, but I can't really tell. Right. And like that same trait, I think, is actually very valuable when you're trying to project strength because it's very hard to read you in the room. I think we saw this with Biden in Afghanistan, and I think we saw it with Obama with the red line. There's a danger in being predictable, where if I say something and the other side goes, well, I know what you're going to do and I can live with it. Well, okay, now what? So I don't know. I'm hopeful, but I wouldn't call that it wasn't a deal breaker for me in either direction. Though I was dismayed by Biden's somewhat tepid support of Israel, but that's my own view.
Sure. So, and look, I welcome disagreement. I mean, for me personally, I've become especially lately a lot less hawkish on these sort of international conflicts, especially when the more I read into them, and just a lot of that's shaping my opinion on this. And I'll be honest with you. I think that there probably is a little bit of an anti-hawkishness blind spot when it comes to Israel, a little bit, right? Yeah, I think Israel needs to exist, and I think that it is a U.S. ally. But I think there's a real question as to how long is this conflict supposed to go, and what's the end goal here? Because the entire Gaza Strip is occupied, and I don't know what's going to happen, and it doesn't seem like anybody really knows what's going to happen, and that bothers me. When you have a defeated enemy, the idea is that at that point, peace should come quickly. And I feel as though we're essentially there, but instead of peace coming quickly, now we have an invasion of Syria, right? That was actually relatively unprompted. It's not like, Hezbollah and Lebanon, which was firing rockets into Israel first. Okay, Israel comes in and wipes them out. This was, the Syrian government collapses and, without much fire, without any, as far as I'm aware, coming from the Syrian side, you see an invasion and occupation of the rest of the Golan. When it comes to Ukraine, I think that I'm a lot of people, especially on the internet, especially in these streaming spaces, are very hawkish when it comes to Ukraine. I think, and I'm just not, right. I think I want that's an incredibly bloody conflict. A lot of people have been killed, and I want fighting to stop. And so when I hear Trump say we're going to end that conflict, uh, you know, I, I'm hopeful too, right? I'm hopeful that he goes in there and comes up with something. Now, does ending the conflict mean okay, all of Ukraine is now no? That can't be it, right? there needs to be some negotiation in which there's actually give and take, and there's give from the Russian side, right? I understand, but the problem is for me is, they're winning the war, and I'm concerned that we could see perhaps something happen like we saw in just recently Syria or Afghanistan or Vietnam, where there's a breaking point, and then you see a sweep, and the entire area begins to fall, and that's what I'm concerned about, and that's what I don't want to see. So I liked his, and I definitely understand there's room for disagreement, but I was more satisfied with his geopolitical geopolitical
Yeah.
policies than I was with her, because for her, I mean, maybe you would agree with this. I think for Kamala Harris, her proposals, I don't even know if her proposal was just more or less the status quo.
I don't think she had. I don't. I'm not speaking about her policy page, and it's possible she wrote something down there. The fundamental problem, like I said earlier in this conversation, for me with her, is that I thought she had made it clear she was willing to take whatever position the party wanted to take. I don't think she was running as somebody with strong, nuanced, particular views or even a particular style. I think she was very openly just kind of following directions. And the problem with that is I didn't like her as a candidate when she ran the first time. And
no one did.
Yeah, no one did. And I remember how she got the VP job. I was there. I saw it, right? So I don't, it's not a plus in her column, because I think the best case scenario would be, as you said, the status quo, but actually it's really just a vote for the DNC, essentially, to pick foreign policy. I'm hopeful, because I do think, the way I'm rooting for Trump. Let's put it that way. I do view geopolitics in something like a zero-sum way. And I think there are like major powers that project strength through minor powers. And it is useful and important for America to keep projecting strength, because I like the way the world works when the Western world is ascendant. That's my preference. And it is not clear to me that anybody else is positioned to do what we do right now. So I would probably be less pleased with a geopolitic that was more China dominated or more Russia dominated than more U.S. Western dominated. That said, there's limits to every principle, right? Like you can't sacrifice endless bodies into the meat grinder. So that you have to, at a certain point, you have to know when a battle is lost and come to some resolution. But the resolution needs to have teeth. Yeah. And it needs to be the kind of thing where in 4 years from now, we're not having another Russian invasion. Because, fool me once, right? Fool me twice. Well, now the third, come on. Like, if there's a third one, it's like, how often can this go on before we're, really showing exactly what NATO was for? And I don't think anyone wants that. That's completely. Kind of like the worst thing. Yeah.
I think there needs to be security assurances. 100%.
Yeah. With the Middle East, I think you're going to see Israel do what Israel does. I think there was, if you look at the history of Israel, it's a history of war being declared on Israel, Israel winning decisively, and then maximizing the conflict and expanding its borders in the process until it is told to stop. And then it stops and it's bigger.
And then it's attacked again, and then it cycle repeats. Yeah.
And the reason it does that is fairly self-evident. The bigger the buffer, the less likely you are to have strikes in Tel Aviv. It's from a military security standpoint, it makes total sense. Did you watch The West Wing?
Did I watch what?
The West Wing?
No.
It's an amazing show, but they're talking about the Middle East in that show, and it could be today. It's from the 90s, but it's the same players, the same story, the same conflict. And they were saying, well, what do we need to do to buy goodwill in the Middle East? And this character just fucking breaks down because he's just so frustrated about the conversation. He goes, they'll like us when we win. They'll like us when we win. Because it doesn't appear to be a middle ground in that negotiation. There's no middle ground between, we want to level Gaza and expand our settlements and from the river to the sea. That's not a compromised position. So until there's a credible actor who can actually come to the table with a reasonable proposal that's credible and that would have support of the people on his side, it's going to be force projection. And as long as it's force projection, Israel's just going to take what it can get because they'll like us when we win.
Leaving aside Ukraine, because I do think that Trump's position on that is better. I am a little bit, I guess, agnostic though towards the question of, is Trump going to be a better choice in terms of resolving the conflict in Gaza, or do you think Kamala Harris would have been better specifically for that conflict?
I think Trump's better there.
Okay.
I don't think the half measures are helpful. I think that this is this is a new age. This is kind of the nature of asymmetric internet-based war, where like a lot of the fighting is about the internet propaganda. That's what the fight is on some level. And I think that what Trump does is, because he's been so historically strong on Israel, he projects absolute U.S. commitment. And with absolute U.S. commitment, it's easier to negotiate, because you're saying, well, whatever the propaganda is, whatever the attempt is to sway the UN, whatever the attempt is to weaken Israel, it's not working. They have the necessary support they need. So that's now a stable. That's a stable variable, right? We're not guessing. X is X. We know exactly what it is. And since we know that, we can now look at the other parts of the equation and try to come up with some deal. Whereas if it looks like, I forgot the nature of the vote exactly, but the Biden administration skipped a veto in the Security Council for Israel at one point.
I didn't know that.
They skipped one. It wasn't like the end of days, but they skipped one veto. Normally, the U.S. vetoes everything that targets Israel. They skipped one to send a message, and I didn't think that was the right message to send. I think you need to keep things very, very, very stable in that region, in hopes that you can eventually come to some kind of agreement. Though, and truthfully, that's what all these conflicts are, right? Like these are all Iranian proxy states. And the question is, can they gain ground on Israel through their proxies, or will Israel show that their military remains so superior to anything in the region that this stuff is somewhat irrelevant to them in terms of actual conflict, and things will stabilize, hopefully. But
right.
I don't know. I'm rooting for him. I hope that he can go in there and project strength and reach some kind of end.
Yeah, and I would also bring ask you about Syria, but the reality is that happened so quickly that we're still trying to pick up the pieces and figure out what happened. Right? We don't know what happened, and we really don't know what's next. So I think that what I want to see with that is maybe a few more months of just reporting and information before I even come to a decision as to my thoughts on that, because Assad was horrible. My understanding is the new leader has, at least in the past, had links to Al Qaeda, was an Al Qaeda affiliate, and that's concerning. So if we don't see the kind of worst case scenario that some people say might happen, I think it could be a good thing, right? If this new leader is dedicated towards kind of, look, we want to make the West happy, and we also want to increase stability. So we're not going to massacre minorities. We're not going to implement any kind of like jihadist law. We're going to create a new kind of secular democracy that actually has individual rights more at the forefront than before. If that happens, I'll be that'd be good. I'd be satisfied, right? I mean, that'd be a good outcome, I think, to a long and drawn out conflict. But again, I just don't know yet. So.
No, I don't. You're right. No one does. And in a sense, by the way, that's actually the exact argument of why America supports Israel, right? Like the truth is, in that region, you topple one dictator to have them replaced by a worse one, and then you have the Arab Spring. Intervention does not typically lead to a desirable outcome on any sort of straight line or reasonable time frame, and there's a lot of blood and loss in the process. And a lot of the reason for support of Israel is that Israel is a known commodity. Like what kind of government they're going to have, what kind of rights they're going to afford their citizens, what their view on the West and the U.S. is going to be. It actually, it is kind of the one thing you can do in the region that actually has some kind of stable pro-Western sensibility to it. But it is obviously matchbox in a football field, and the rest of the football field is deeply offended by its presence. So it's going to continue to cause all the friction that it causes. And yeah, I mean, I think if you or I had a solution to the Middle East, we'd be at the White House right now.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Who knew? We can't solve the problem.
Yeah, it's that area is difficult to fix,
Yeah.
but here's hoping.
If you don't mind the segue, the it's the same attitude I have in some senses towards Doge and the attempt to deregulate and get and work on the deficit. Like, I have some concerns about whether or not these are the right cast of characters to get this job done. That said, it's a target. I've just been dreaming that somebody would take a look at the deficit or the state of overregulation my entire adult life. There's never been political will to do it. It's going to have to be a 2-year window because the cost is high, and you probably will lose the midterms if you're serious about it. But a one-term president who's focused on it is the only scenario where this could happen. So I don't know. Like, do I have my reservations about them as the people executing it? Candidly, yeah. But man, am I rooting for them. Like, it's if it was ever going to happen, it's now. And God bless. I hope they pull this off.
Yeah. So as a libertarian, I'm fairly antagonistic towards the government, and it's a little bit ironic. I know I'm in a profession that really exemplifies government power, but it's something I've always been skeptical of. Even back when I was voting for Bernie Sanders, and I was very much more left wing, left oriented. The skepticism of government power and government tyranny was a major factor in most of my thinking, and Doge, I think, represents exactly what you're talking about, at least a step forward and a recognition, some kind of definitive recognition of, we know this is a problem. It's not a problem that we just give like one-liners about on debate stages. We got to tackle the debt. No, it's actually, hey, this is a problem. Government bloat's a problem. Overspending is a problem. Spending money on all the random shit we spend money on, it's a problem. And we're going to try. We're going to actually try, and here's how we're going to try. We got this, we got the Doge. We're going to make it transparent. We're going to be talking specifically about the things that we want cut, and we're going to put them forward, and we're going to see, see what happens. As much as I really want it to happen, and as much as I think that we might get some tidbits, we might get a little bit of scraps and morsels thrown at us here from Doge. I'm very skeptical about anything actually serious getting done, because I think that that there's a stability in the U.S. System that I think is good, but there's also a stability that I think is bad, in that there is a the way our politics tends to reward short-term action with disregard
Mhm.
for long-term consequences. And so, if a difficult decision has to be made, look, we're gonna have to cut, Social Security, let's say. I mean, the thing that nobody can even talk about because of how controversial it is.
Yeah.
But let's say it
So,
comes to that point.
of course, when neither of us get those benefits, then we'll be mad we didn't. But yeah.
Sure, right. And so, we got to cut Social Security or whatever. Any president who does that is going to become immensely unpopular amongst a voting demographic that is
Mhm.
highly active in the short term, which has major political consequences. So what do you do? I mean, like, let's just imagine a situation in which it has to be cut. You don't cut it. Okay, well, we got to figure out some way to pay for it then. No, because that has negative consequences too. And so you begin to see this amalgamation of uh, short-term action that will lead, I think, to long-term catastrophe. And I do wonder what percentage of our budget will start being eaten up, paying for the interest on our debt, before at some point somebody makes an actually difficult decision and
I
either
mean,
cuts something massive.
It's the second largest expenditure by category right now. It's entitlements that it's more than the military,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
is
I saw
crazy.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a crazy amount. I unfortunately, I think you're right. Is that one thing that most people don't understand about our budget is that it's most of it isn't discretionary. So if you're looking at discretionary cuts, meaning like incidental programs, 100 million for this, 100 million for that, you're never actually, unless you cut all of it, you're just not going to get to the $1 trillion, deficit, budget deficit that we have. You would have to start looking at military and mandatory spending, meaning entitlements, which for all the reasons you well put, it just seems unlikely. Where I think they could, I think they'll cut, I think they'll find 100 billion, 200, they'll find some money, but it's not, that sounds like a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket for the kind of sums we're talking about. Where I think they might have more success, though, is in deregulation. Because now the Supreme Court has articulated that there's this major questions doctrine, and Chevron is dead. If you go into these agencies and you strip the existing regs, you and then say, okay, we need to rebuild our regs. Rebuilding is actually it's a different playing field. The agencies have a lot less discretion than they used to have because the court has taken away some of their power. And it's going to be a slower process to bring the regulatory malaise back in. I was on a panel with Wick recently talking about this, and the story I like to tell, I had a client, Navient. This is on the district of DC, if anyone cares about the docket and wants to look it up. But Navient was a student loan, is in the student loan business. And back when in the 80s, Navient was, the government desperately wanted people to do student loan servicing. They couldn't get enough student loan servicers. So the government was actually giving incentives to get financial players into the market because they were so desperate to fund this student loan initiative. Obviously, politics change. So anyway, back then, they passed a regulation that was completely no one knows what it means. Totally inscrutable. So Navient and a bunch of other servicers went to the DOE. This is the late 80s, early 90s, and they said, "Hey, if we read this paragraph in your reg literally, I think we are going to make a lot of money on this category of loans. Is that right?" And the government said, "Yeah," and they published informal guidance that said exactly that. And then they republished that exact same informal guidance. And it said exactly the same thing again. So Navient made like 15, 20, $25 million on this bucket that they wouldn't have made otherwise because the government said they could. Then at the end of the Trump administration, the politics on student loans have really changed. The DOE audits them and says, you have to give us that money back. And we said, well, what do you mean we have to give you the money back? You told us that we could do this. We have the letters you sent. It's your guidance. And I swear to God, for those of you who don't know, when you litigate with an agency, you're not even in court. You're litigating against the agency, but the judge is an agency employee. So obviously you lose every time. So you just go through the exercise of losing until you can get to a real court. So we go through the exercise of losing. We actually get to the acting head of the DOE, who of course rules against us and writes. I swear to God, to the extent you relied on our guidance, it was unreasonable for you to do so because our guidance was contrary to our operating statute. Our guidance was illegal. And foolish you for relying on it, give us our money back. Right? So obviously they got laughed out of court. Like the district judge he basically copy-pasted our briefs into his opinion. He was so incensed by this whole thing. But I tell the story because I don't think people who, if you're not a lawyer and you don't work with regulatory agencies, you might think that this is a sane place where things happen for orderly reasons because there's people who just love education and they're trying to build regs for the betterment of everybody. That's not what happens. It is a political agency that gets replaced and they never rescind anything. They just build and build and build and build a spiderweb of regs until eventually they have a credible argument that everything is illegal because there's so many regs and no one knows what they mean. And the only way you can avoid it is to hire someone like you or me to show up and argue at exorbitant rates. And it's crazy. It is I mean, obviously very bad for small business, but it's like the YIMBY thing. When you have this amount of regulation, people can't build. When you have this amount of regulation, people can't do business. And will that have a direct effect on the deficit? Hard to say, but I do think trimming the regs down to something a little bit more reasonable would be a very worthy endeavor. And that is something I think they could do.
I actually, and I hadn't thought about it this way. I like the point about how the destruction of Chevron, which I think I knew had major implications for a number of other reasons too. But this is, I mean, the idea here that, well, this would make certain levels of deregulation more permanent.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point,
Yeah.
right? Because right now, I mean, they have they have this. I guess not right now anymore, but they had this deference that was just so expansive. To what you're saying, where they can not only the deference to them was so absurd, where they sort of acted with this level of impunity where they could be self-contradictory, and they had to, I think, go pretty far to eventually run into some issues where a judge would say, look, this is just ridiculous, right? But now that that's gone, and if a lot of those those rules, those administrative rules get removed, the codes, then they're not going to be able just to throw them back on and then just roll with them like they're running. They're going to be tested in court, right? Oh, you're asserting this? Well, you don't have the deference anymore. It's about what the statute empowers you to do, and I think that's going to be it's an interesting way to look at it. I think you're right. I think that this could be a way to help solidify longer lasting deregulation. And that's actually, it's curious. I want to bring this back, I guess, a little bit to the motivation for voting for Trump, okay? Because again, to me, what this paints a picture of is an administration that has a chance at solving problems for potentially quite a long time. Not only perhaps having a Supreme Court that is going to be originalist dominated for the next 20 to 25 years, depending on if Alito and Thomas retire, and depending on, Sotomayor, I know, unfortunately has some health issues and everything. That could potentially be another originalist spot. But also a potential reduction in the regulatory state going for another 20, 25 years. Who knows? So, in terms of like the long-term effect here, I mean, doesn't this just make an even stronger case to vote for Trump for the long-term benefits and the long-term stability of the republic?
I mean, look, in a universe where, and I don't know he's going to do this, but in a universe where Trump appoints some originalists to the bench, effectively deregulates, effectively unleashes the economy, brings sanity to border policy, and then, basically what I'm saying is, in a world where Trump is focused on his historic legacy rather than his personal goals and ambitions, he might end up being looked at very fondly in long-term history when people look at things he accomplished. The other way this could go in is, he appoints his family members to all these positions. Yeah. He's really more concerned with setting up his kids' political futures than he is with his legacy, because he's going to be dead. Who cares? And like I could, with him, there's always a question of what his priority is. And in the first term he had, I didn't really get a clear sense that his priority was legacy focused in the way I would like it to be. But again, I'm rooting for the guy, because if he comes in and, God, okay, let's say they come in, they cut a couple hundred off the budget. It's not going to be world ending, but it's something. They deregulate quite a bit. They secure an originalist majority. International affairs aren't solved, but stabilize. And the border is, buffered. And now there's some kind of semblance of a border policy. Wow, that would be a tremendous legacy. That would be a heck of an accomplishment. And I'm hoping that he sees that and then can say, well, I'm going to ride off into the sunset. People are going to remember me for what I did, not what I said in my method of communication, but for what I accomplished. And quite frankly, if he does that, he was very astute with picking Vance. So if he does all that, he's then now the kingmaker because Vance is going to be miles ahead of everybody going into the next cycle. So who knows? We'll see.
I think so. I think you're right, and I also think that there's a little bit of a culture shift as well, perhaps towards the right. And so, if assuming that everything you're saying happens, assuming that kind of best case scenario happens, I could see JD Vance having a massive advantage. But I also agree that if it's more self-centered and sort of, well, I'm going to be dead soon, who cares? I mean, that would be very disappointing. And
so maybe I can simplify the election for me. If I voted for the left, I was certain they would do things I did not want them to do. If I voted for Trump, I was reasonably certain he was aiming in a direction I wanted to, with a variable wild card of total catastrophe. And that's at the end of the day, that unpredictability is his asset and also his greatest liability, right? Like I struggle to get a read on him, and I don't think I'm unique in that. I think that most people struggle to get a read on him.
I agree. One of the things, though, President Biden, I think, sort of sold himself as this predictable and stable president. But there's been a couple of things that have come out recently that I think, for me, challenge the idea. And I'm curious that if you had known these things, would you have still voted for him in 2020? The first one being the fact that he pardoned his son, Hunter. To me, that sort of rings of, I'm going to be dead soon anyway, who cares? That was the first thing I thought about with that action. But then the second thing is, I think there was a recent report that just came out from White House aides indicating that his cognitive decline was actually noticed by White House aides a lot faster than had been previously thought, apparently within the first 12 months of his administration. So, I mean, do either of those things to you taint the legacy of Biden, or do you think that they're more or less irrelevant?
I think his legacy's garbage, so I'm not sure how much they're changing it. But he's a bottom tier president already in my mind. But look, he pardoning his son. I've got kids. Yeah, is it a good political move? No, it's poison for the Democrats. Like, it's a terrible political move. I'm sure the party's pretty upset about it. And even his statement, beyond the pardon, his statement had raised so many questions because he was saying, like, basically, it was a politically motivated prosecution. They wanted to prosecute him for political reasons. So it's like, you're the president. The DOJ is an executive branch. Who's they? Who's the they that has so much sway inside the DOJ that you, as the president, can't counteract it? There is no answer to that question that is good. Because he's the president. I get the concept of independent agencies, but that was one of those moments where you're like, when Trump says something and he's being hyperbolic and it's too much, but he's talked about the deep state all the time. That was a moment where I was like, oh, he just candidly admitted that there is an entrenched bureaucratic power that can pressure people in this way. Because that's the only, either he's just making stuff up, but if you take him at his word, that's what he means. But look, I mean, I thought he should have pardoned Trump. So, the fact that he's using the pardon power aggressively doesn't bother me particularly. Very aggressively, but I mean, it's his power to use. And, people got so mad at me when I was talking about this because my circles are overwhelmingly left. But I was saying, God, if Biden just went the Ford route and pardoned Trump like pardoning Nixon, it's better. It's better.
I wanted Trump to pardon Hunter. I was really hoping that Joe Biden wouldn't, and then Trump get elected, and then he would pardon Hunter. That would be great.
Well, it's so symbolically important, where you say, like, bad stuff happened. And I think we agree on this. The stuff that happened with Trump losing that election was bad. It shouldn't have happened. But we're going to move forward, and we're not going to get into the weeds of it and attack you and put you into a life or death legal situation. which, by the way, won him the election overwhelmingly. Like if you look at the numbers when the indictments came out, he was neck and neck with DeSantis. I thought Ron was going to take it. I was in a,
I voted for
I was,
DeSantis in the primary.
oh my God, yeah, I didn't quite realize how bad he was on debates, but I was very pro Ron at that moment. And yeah, the indictments came out and Trump was 30 points ahead. It was just absolute crushing defeat. And now he's essentially going to win all these cases one way or the other. So what did you get out of it? Like you convinced people that the legal system can be used for political reasons. You convinced people that powerful politicians can defeat the legal system, not on the merits, but on politics and procedure, which is another blow to the rule of law. And there's going to be reprisals. There's no chance that Trump's going to do nothing when he gets in office to get some payback. I think that seems very unlikely to me.
Kash Patel, I think you're right.
Yeah, this was a tremendously destabilizing move for the long-term future of the rule of law, which not only cost the Democrats an election, but it was just a catastrophically bad idea, and we had an example to look at. Do you think anyone was psyched about Nixon getting pardoned at the time? People were like, "Oh my God, well, Tricky Dick. I guess he's a nice guy. Let's give that." Of course, that was an agonizing decision, but there were good reasons for it.
So the first, that totally addresses the Hunter Biden aspect. But one of the major concerns that people had, and I'm also going to ask you some questions about what I see as another one of the sort of non-legal guardrails, the primary process kind of getting overridden, which I think was a major concern of mine. And I know Democrats like Wick, for example, who and you've talked to, he was very upset about the fact that Biden was sort of removed, despite the fact that he had won the primary. But now that we have this report saying, hey, the cognitive decline started happening a lot quicker than than had been previously let on, I still think at the very least there was enough public knowledge by the time of the Hur report in February that, the fact that in February you had the Democratic machine sort of begin to deny just what I think was just glaringly obvious, but now obvious in the legal sense, right? Now we actually have a sort of an authorized document here from an independent investigator, independent counsel, who is putting out, look, we're not going to hold him responsible for these crimes because of his mental decline. And Robert Hur was dragged up in front of Congress and was berated for this. And there was no legal basis to do so. Even PISCO was defending Robert Hur. From what Congress was doing. What Congress was doing was absolutely just partisan and embarrassing. For me, I think that the Hur report could have been it should have been taken as a warning, but the Democrats took it as a challenge. And if they had taken it as a warning and actually incorporated that into the primary process, I think that we could have avoided what was a very major, I think, strategic blow to the legitimacy of the Democrats, which was the removal of Joe Biden and the sort of anointing of Kamala Harris. But it also would have removed something that the Democrats have been doing for a while now, right? I talked about voting for Bernie Sanders in 2016. We know that the DNC was antagonistic towards Bernie Sanders in 2016. And despite the fact that the RNC was antagonistic towards Trump in 2016, that didn't matter, right? He was still, through the sheer force of will and the fact that the RNC doesn't have these same mechanisms that the DNC has, he was able to, just basically say, fuck you to the old elite of the RNC and take the position because he had that popular will. I mean, when the Hur report came out, what was your initial thoughts? And did you think at that point, look, the Dems need to take this seriously. This needs to be something that they're actually considering as a warning and not a challenge.
This might be just to back up a little bit further.
Sure.
Even pre the Hur report, let's say in the last 2 years of Biden's presidency, I thought he was going to lose against any Republican. I at no point thought he was going to win this election. And the reason was this is going way, way back, but one of my like glass breaking moments was the Rittenhouse trial
Yes.
because
We're going to talk about that.
yeah, at the time I was still a Democrat, though I had kind of like I'd read Scalia and been like, huh, that's a good point, but I hadn't left the party, right? And I was told all these things, and I wasn't told them subtly. It wasn't like I picked up in the grapevine. There's express statements made by prominent Democrats about who this guy is and what happened, and then I watched that trial. And it was pandemic era, so I was at home every day. So I just had it on in the background while doing my work, right? So I literally was watching the whole thing. And as I was watching, I was like, I'm texting my Democratic friends, and they're all like, he's gonna get convicted. I'm like, there's no chance. This is the easy, like, it's embarrassing this case was even brought. Like, this case is so bad, it's impossible to understand why someone brought it, except they're trying to make some political bones. This is a bad case. And that was a glass shatter moment about media literacy for me. So flash forward to Biden. What I was saying in the last 2 years of his campaign of his presidency was, look, the Democrat, meaning the Democrat establishment, managed to pull it off once because it was COVID and he didn't have to do public events and he could campaign from a basement. But there's no way that this guy survives the rigors of the campaign trail. There's no way he can't do it. He's going to fall apart. He's gaffe prone anyway. I didn't predict it would be this bad. Like, it was worse than I could have imagined.
That debate was rough.
That was the worst, most disqualifying thing I've ever seen politically. But yeah, I was expecting him to fall apart. And this is where I started getting very frustrated, is because I was also there when Harris was picked as VP. I remember the criteria, which was, I need a woman of color to be my VP.
Yep.
He picked Rice, who would have been better, but she was disqualified for a number of reasons. So then he picked, in his mind, the second best available woman of color, which, again, the tremendous disservice to her is making that all public. Just pick her. Like, have your criteria. Like, you don't have to tell us what the criteria are. Just pick her. But when you publicly,
he did the same thing for the Supreme Court justice as well. Same criteria.
Yeah. And it was doing that to Justice Jackson was a tremendous disservice to her legacy, because you can pick whoever you want to pick. You don't have to announce it to us. Like, and by the way, Justice Jackson, I don't love her rulings or style on the bench, but she's, it's not like she's not credentialed. She's not like she's unqualified. She's a totally conscionable pick, and you could have made it without saying all those things. But people remember that you did. And then they say, well, is she the best person? It's like, well, no, that's not how she got the job. And we all remember that. And we remember it in the context of an old man who was struggling physically and could die in office, and has, it turns out, been very limited in office. This is the kind of president who needs a capable VP pick who can run the country. And that's not what we got. The Her report, I think, was confirmation of what I had seen with my own two eyes over the course of several years, and it only got worse from there. And the more they denied it, the worse it got. And I guess there are some people who are so enamored in a particular bubble that wasn't obvious to them, but it was increasingly obvious that it was bad. And I remember when the Her report came out, I was like, well, that's got to be the end of the road, right? Like, that's the most damaging thing I've ever seen, because I hadn't seen the debate yet.
Yeah. No, and here's, like, following the Her report, there was a panel set up. Wick set it up, and there was a lot of left-leaning people on the other side, and we went into the panel, and I was the only one who actually read the Her report, and nobody else had. And so, first of all, I mean, that's a little bit frustrating, but because it was a debate on the Her report, right? The topic was that. Yeah, the topic was on the Her report. We're going to discuss the Her report. Who's read it? Lactoid. That's it. And so I'm citing it, like, I'm the one on page this is what was said on page this, and there's no, like, real response, but there is all the points are still met with antagonism. All the points are still met with that can't be true. You can point to, like, look at this video. He seems to be fine here. look at this video, here's Trump also being like weird, like and not talking correctly and saying the wrong words and act, et cetera. And going through the whole thing, there was just a complete unwillingness to even acknowledge some of the points, because I saw it as a catch-22, and I kept trying to make this point. What Hur is saying here is that if he wasn't this forgetful old man, he should be charged. Like and there's, I know, some like presidential issues, I guess, but at the very least, like, he would have been charged had he potentially not been the president, right? And the only reason he's not, or that he shouldn't be, is because he's a forgetful old man. So when you're denying that he's a forgetful old man, you're saying that he should be charged. But no, you're not saying that. That can't be the conclusion, because he shouldn't be charged, because he's the honest guy and Trump's the liar. And then I would say, okay, so he's an honest guy, so he's a forgetful old man then. No, he's not. He's sharp as a tack. Look at him. Look at the way he talks. He's like, here's one video of him being relatively lucid. There was it was impossible to find like some kind of concession there. And, it was just denial. More people were brought in, denial. And, it was just sort of, I just kept saying the same thing. We kept getting denials until he was pulled and Kamala Harris was anointed. Then the conversation switched, and maybe he was actually kind of an issue. But hey, we have Kamala now, so who cares?
And that's why the Democrats lost. It's hubris.
It was hubris.
It's just hubris, right? Because, like I said earlier in the discussion, it was clear to anyone who was paying attention that he should be a one-term president. Like, you couldn't have possibly thought he was going to make it 2 terms. Like, he's not vigorous in that way. So, even setting aside the Hur report and all the stuff we later learned, that should have been the expectation from the beginning. And it's just hubris. That's all. And that hubris is why the Democrats lost this election, more than any other factor. And you see it online, by the way, all the time. Like, we try to get in a thread about lessons learned from the election, and people
don't even try.
The lesson we've learned is that we should double down on what didn't work. We should just make sure that we're going to do the same thing again. Now, we have a blueprint. We know Trump won twice and lost twice. We know what works and what doesn't, but we're going to do what doesn't work, because we think that the voters are stupid. And that's just not, no party can win on that.
Yeah. So in terms of, and I wanted to ask you very point blank, in terms of, there's a primary that happens, and the primary winner is pulled several months before the actual election. And without a new primary, and I think a snap primary could have been possible potentially, but at the very least, the fact that it took so long, again, was the fault of the DNC taking the report as a challenge as opposed to a warning. And just several months before the election, putting up somebody else. To me, that's actually really concerning. If they had done that to Trump, I would be deeply concerned. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's for those of you who are thinking of going to law school, read the Federalist Papers. In fact, even if you're not going, read the Federalist Papers. But if you're going, definitely read them. And there's a reason why the founders were not enamored with the ideas of political parties, and it's exactly this scenario, which is that the party becomes a faction, and then it is beholden only to itself.
Yeah,
and it is able to anoint somebody. Now, look, I'm not making a technical legal argument, because you vote for the ticket, you vote for the and the electors go, like, there's all these technicalities that go into it. I'm asking the broader question about, like, what does a political party do, and what should it do? And yeah, at minimum, I thought the Democratic voters were owed an open primary, or an open convention. Like, you needed to do something, and you had, in U.S. elections, you can say there isn't enough time because our election cycle is so long. But in many countries, like France, like the entire election takes place in less time than the Democrats had. So I think you could have done something. And look, she had a great honeymoon. They had a strategy that they executed. She was doing really well after they executed it. It just turned out that she had to start talking eventually, and that didn't go very well.
It felt so
Um,
manufactured, like the honeymoon kind of media blitz that occurred. I mean, to me, it felt so fake that I think that's like when the gleam began to wear off is when I think that Trump started gaining again in the polls,
yeah,
and ultimately won. And I guess I don't know. It was surprising to me how, because I think in the week before the election, like 85% of the coverage in Kamala was positive, or somewhere maybe it was 70 something percent, but it was a vast majority, and the vast majority of media coverage of the main networks on Trump was negative, and
well,
so
the Democrats don't put up candidates like that. Like if you look at like the Democratic candidates in like in my lifetime, the Democrats, have a type, and their type tends to be kind of heavyweight, right? You have like Rhodes scholars like Clinton. Hillary Clinton is probably like the biggest policy wonk of all time. Kerry, Gore. You can talk about even Biden with his like incredible years of service. You can talk about like and foreign policy chops. You can talk about like the hubris and the elitism and the flaws of the Democratic Party, but they typically put up people who are quite substantive. That's one of the things that they do in my mind well. That's that's not this scenario. Like if you stack up her credentials and accomplishments and record against any of the people I just named, she seems vastly unqualified. Even like Bernie, as kind of like a quote unquote insurgent, has been a senator forever,
yeah,
and exactly what he stands for and has been transparent about that forever.
since the fucking
And
'80s, to give him credit, I mean, the dude is pretty consistent.
like putting up somebody who comes across as a lightweight who's just towing the party line is unusual. That's not what the Democrats do when they're successful. Let's put it that way. And yeah, I thought she was a historically weak candidate, and you saw the difference. Hillary Clinton was a deeply flawed candidate, and that election was razor thin. I mean, that could have been decided by any little thing. Would have traded this one. This was not a close election.
No, I completely think you're right. You did mention the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and
Sure, she,
I want to talk a little bit about that, just because that was something that I spent a lot of time talking about, and I
for good
actually
reason.
I live in Wisconsin, so it happened in my state, and it was something that a lot of people were directly invested in, and it was something that people were, you know, asking me a lot of questions about, obviously just in the day to day. Hey, did you hear about this? What are your thoughts on what happened? And following, and I also watched the trial and looked at the the videos and the evidence and everything, and heard the arguments that people had put forward, and and then the verdict happened, and there's a lot of people that were upset about it, a lot of people I know that were upset about it, and there's a poll on this. 2/3 of Republicans were satisfied, like, yeah, he should have been acquitted. 3/4 of Democrats said he should have been found guilty. And that stat blew my mind. That was wild because to me, I thought it was, yeah, there's a few vocal lefties that are like, being pretty loud about how Kyle Rittenhouse is a killer and, he should be gone after. But it seemed to be that there was a almost not unanimous, but there was a large majority of Democrats that were against Kyle Rittenhouse. And, I would talk with them. And the first thing, obviously, is, yeah, it would be, if he had killed white people, he was like, shit, they don't even know the basics of what happened, right? He didn't, there were, the people that he shot were not, they were white, right? Gage Grosskreutz,
Yeah,
Rosenbaum.
if he drove across state lines with a
Yeah.
gun to black people, and I'm like, the only correct word in that sentence is he. Like everything else you said, it's factually wrong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's difficult to have a conversation with you if you're just going to be that wrong.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and so then I start with trying to correct some of the base level like misunderstandings, and so there have been a few there's been a few people I've spoken with that once I lay out all the facts, they're
Mhm.
actually and I can prove it because all this is available on the internet. They've actually come around. This is something that I do think that there are, like, among Democrats, there's a lot of people who actually are somewhat sensible about the
Mhm.
principles and the philosophy about what happened, but they've been misled by like on an empirical question about what actually happened. And so if you can correct that for them, they'll switch. But there's been a few where they do fully understand all the empirical questions
Mhm.
and they just don't care. And those are the people that scare me. Those are the people that bother me a lot because with the, Kyle, say what you want about, sure, a little bit of a happy amateur, but the level of trigger discipline and just obvious, like what he only fired at Gage when the pistol was actually aimed at him. He hit him in the arm, which people say that as a meme, like, oh, you should have shot the gun out of his hand. Like I shoot,
Yeah.
you never plan on that. This guy actually did it, right? And then he stopped engaging with anybody who ceased being a threat, and he never engaged anybody that wasn't a threat. That is an incredible amount of trigger discipline. Um, it almost to me seems like a textbook case of self-defense, textbook. But there's still people. Again, I don't know what percentage of that 3/4, or I guess even the 1/3 of Republicans that are just simply misled on the empirical issues, and they would come around if they knew everything. But some portion truly, I guess, I must think, do they just not believe in self-defense? I don't know. I mean, what has been your experience discussing that case with people?
At the risk of going like philosophy bro on you, which is my other pet interest, um, a big part of my disillusionment with the left was the slow realization that this is increasingly a collection of postmodernists and relativists. And the reason I say that is that they aren't bothered by the contradiction. Like the primary goal is the political, right? And that's why when people throw around the term like woke left, woke right, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They're talking about people who have jettisoned the idea of fundamental neutral principles and instead are saying, we want to win. We have political goals and we would like to win. So the question is a guilty verdict good or bad for our political cause? And if he was guilty, that would have been great for certain political causes. And that's the answer. And I this is something that happens on both sides of the spectrum, but you can't run a society like that. You just can't. If the only question is, am I getting what I want? The rule of law is dead. There's nothing to it because you don't believe in the rule of law. You believe the outcome of the trial should be based on what is good for you politically, or your own personal ambitions, and that's wildly dangerous. And I've seen the same thing. Like I'll even walk someone. You do the Socratic thing. You walk them through it. You get to the point where they make the contradictory statement. You're like, well, you can't hold both those beliefs at the same time, and they'll say, I don't care. Right? The contradiction doesn't bother them because they don't structure their thinking around that sort of like, we must find neutral principles, we must apply them categorically, we know we are imperfect, but we're going to do our best.
It's actually sort of a fundamentally anti-originalist way of thinking that's perhaps developed.
Yes. This is why I ended up becoming an originalist, is because when I started reading, this is a tangent, but I was in France because law school's amazing, and it's a hard job, but there's perks. But I was in France when the Obergefell decision came out, and I was very pro the outcome. I hadn't read it, but I was like, okay, great. Gay marriage, this is no longer a problem. I have a lot of gay friends. They can finally get married. I have gay family members. I don't think they want to get married, but they could if they want to. Outcome-wise, this is great. I'm very happy. And I was sitting in this cafe in Paris looking so smug, looking at all these Parisians and going like, God, I'm going to be a U.S. lawyer and look at this amazing thing that my profession just did, right? Then I read the decision.
Horrible.
And it
horribly
is
written.
I don't even, there's nothing in, and again, I am supportive of the outcome. Like, I think that is the correct state of affairs. I think, actually, let me take a step back. I don't think the government should have anything to do with the business of marriage. But if they are going to be in the business of marriage, they should open it up as much as they can, because why not, right?
I agree.
But there's nothing in the Obergefell decision that even approaches legal reasoning. It's not even attempting to. It's soaring rhetoric, but there's no point is a legal analysis conducted. And then you read Scalia's dissent, and it just knocked my socks off. And because he said, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't quote it from memory, but he said, this decision, the subject matter of this decision matters to me very little. And in that sense, while I disagree with the outcome, I'm not concerned by it. The thing I'm concerned with is who rules me. And today the court has decided it's 9 unelected lawyers. And that's the point. Like, you have to have rules and norms that are, when you're doing legal analysis, that are stated. And people interpret them, and they interpret them using consistent tools and come to outcomes based on the text and what it meant at the time it was enacted. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing law. And it's the same, like you said, it's the same reasoning. They don't care. They don't care what the self-defense law says. They don't care that he's allowed to carry the gun. They don't like that there's a Second Amendment. So I heard people say this to me. I said, "Oh, well, he's allowed to carry the gun." We're like, "Well, we should get rid of the Second Amendment." I'm like, "Oh, whoa!" Like, even if that's true, we haven't, right? So, like, even if you're right, it was legal for him to do what he did, right? And they're like, "No, I wouldn't go that far." I'm like, "Well, thank God it's not up to you." Jesus.
No, 100%. And with the Obergefell comment, like I had a very similar. I did a very similar thing. I remember I was at the gym. I think it was the day after the decision dropped, and I remember arguing with my friend about it. And I think the argument ended. This was a while ago, so I'll obviously become a little bit better at I think my reasoning. I said it doesn't matter how we got there. I like the decision. I'm glad we're here. That was what I said. Yeah, no, I think we have very perhaps very similar growth trajectory when it comes to, coming to originalism, which is you start reading the cases and reading the theory, and you're like, this seems to be the only one that actually makes sense. Wick asked a question, and Wick is a dear friend of I think both of us. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the question: What's y'all's favorite thing about Democrats right now? So I'm going to think about that a little bit. Do you have any initial thoughts as to and if you think of something later that's that one's even better, but just right as you sit here today, I mean the sort of initial knee jerk. What are the Democrats right now doing right, or is there some kind of trajectory that they're going down that is positive that we like to see? That it's like, oh shit, like they're actually doing this better than the Republicans.
Not sure. I don't know whether or not this is going to become a Democratic thing or not, but I like what Cenk is from Young Turks is doing right now, where he's on this arc where he's saying, "Look, they won," but despite the fact that I disagree with them on everything, there are areas where I don't disagree with them, and there is political will to do things that I think is good. Let me highlight those things instead of getting into absolute, burn it all down mode, which I think is tremendous. And the reason I think it's tremendous is that we've been in, and this is not my favorite thing about Trump. I do not like this about him. He inspires all or nothing in a lot of people, and we've been in that mode for a very long time. And in that sense, everything becomes increasingly extreme. And you can get into why or when that started and who really started it. It doesn't really matter. That's what's been happening. That spirit, like, we're going to find the things that we can compromise on, and we're going to find ways that we can legislate things that are actually important and which the parties agree on, or at least wings of the parties agree on, is a great approach to what's happening right now. And if that becomes the Democratic approach, I think they'll be in a better position, certainly to regain my vote down the road, because temperamentally, I'm inclined to vote for them. In fact, I've never voted for anyone else in a presidential election other than a Democrat. So I would very much love for that to happen, and for this not to turn into everything Trump does is bad because it's Trump doing it situation.
Yeah, I think my answer is a little bit different. I think you can find specific instances of Democrats I think behaving better than Republicans, and you can point to those specific instances and I'll admit hey that was yeah you're right, like that was better than the alternative, true. And so, but it's going to be very specific. So I don't think it really answers the kind of general question, which is like, what is the favorite like trajectory? What is the actual like thing about Democrats right now that you like? And you know, I struggle because for me, Democrats were, and I've said this, they weren't on the table. Like people, when I was saying like I was struggling to come to whether or not I was going to vote for Trump, a lot of people took that as, oh, he's this fake centrist who he doesn't really know if he's going to vote for Harris or Trump. I was never going to vote for Harris. I was clear about that from the beginning. It was either I'm going to vote for Trump or I'm going to vote for the Libertarian candidate. It's going to be third party or Trump. From the very beginning. So there's a lot of issues I have with the Democratic Party, but and this is going to sound like a cop out, but one of the things I've noticed about the Democrats in this sort of TDS sort of world is this opposition to Trump, where I can count on them to oppose almost everything he does. I think just as a party, yeah, there's a little bit of a civil war happening. I understand within the party, there's a little bit of a sort of conflict, but I can count on them to oppose Trump. And Trump has proposed policies that I think are bad. And I am hoping, and I think I can count on Democrats to some extent to oppose them somewhat consistently, even if I'd be worried that the Democrats might support the policies themselves if they were in power. One example I can think of right off the bat would be like the tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Tariffs I think are bad. I think tariffs are a bad idea. Democrats have put in tariffs. Biden kept the tariffs, right? It's not like Democrats have been anti-tariff, but now they're anti-tariff because Trump's pro-tariff. And I need someone to speak up for the anti-tariff side because they're a bad idea. And I can rely on Democrats to do that. I can rely on the fact that now that Trump supports tariffs, we can actually get a conversation about how tariffs are bad, and we can actually have a side oppose them. Good. Like, this is good. And another thing that Trump has proposed that I don't know what your thoughts on this, but I strongly oppose it is the caps on credit cards. Now, I think Bernie would probably support this. I think you're going to see some wing. I still think you might see some Democrats oppose this, but for a whole campaign of railing on the Democrats for implementing price controls, the credit card interest cap is a price control when you actually look at it. I would argue. So I think there is something hypocritical there about being so opposed to price controls and then proposing one. And I hope that he's called out on that. And I hope that the Democrats, perhaps make him think twice about that policy. So it's sort of the worst part of our adversarial sort of system can also produce some of, I think, the best results, which is ideas that the party that you elected, they're not going to produce everything good all the time. They're going to produce a lot of bad ideas. It's important to have those ideas challenged, and the Democrats, I think, have been good on challenging him. And he's somebody that needs to be challenged. The Republicans need to be challenged, and they can't. And there needs to be a fight on some of his policies. You can't let either party just roll, and and get everything done that they want to get done, because everything, I think, will lead to bad results. And so, I think the filibuster is going to stay good. And I don't think the court's going to get packed, which is good. And I think we're going to see some stability, and I think we're going to see policies pushed back on. And you already see policies getting pushed back on, not only by the Democrats, but also within the Republican Party, which is good. I'm excited about that. So I hope that answers the question, Wick. If we want to talk about just policies, I think the Democrats have been better when it comes to drugs than the Republicans have been on for decades. I don't know. What are your thoughts on drug? As an attorney, I'm an attorney that's pretty libertarian when it comes to legalizing drugs and not penalizing drug use. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a complicated one. I think I was knee-jerk libertarian, temperamentally. If I had no other information, that would be the direction I would go. The decriminalization in places like New York or Jersey City or places has been uneven and kind of strange.
Okay.
Where it's you'll have people openly smoking, but then drinking alcohol out of a paper bag. There's kind of a weird disconnect. You're like, wait, what's happening right here? Why is one this way and the other that way, and then the tax revenues are messed up because it's not actually legal; it's just decriminalized. So I think the implementation has not been something I've loved so far, but that probably could be improved. I think big picture though, we picked a fight. We entered into the war on drugs, and drugs won. So that's kind of the state of play, right? It's not You're not gonna really fix that problem, but we've seen, with the opioid epidemic, that access to powerful drugs in at the time a legal or primarily legal way can still have really tremendously terrible effect, especially if it's an addictive substance. Obviously, marijuana is much, either not addictive or much less addictive. So I think at this point, I would need to do it drug by drug and case by case. I would need to have a sense of like what the pros and cons are. I don't think my kind of like libertarian streak is sufficient to give me like an ideological answer.
Okay, that's fair. I guess because I'm pretty extreme in this ideologically, but like let's leave that aside for a second. Talk specifically about marijuana legalization.
Mhm.
My understanding on this is that Democrats have been. I mean, they're consistently better in terms of my ideology,
Yeah.
but I think they're also consistently better when it comes to treating marijuana specifically, um, just more reasonably. At least when it comes to like evaluating the empirical outcomes of the policy, right? Like you have Colorado legalize it, and you have like specific outcomes that are related to that, and the Democrats will talk about those outcomes and say, like, look, here are the specific outcomes. Here are the challenges that come up. Here's how we have to implement the positives, or we can get the positives, and we also have to account for the negatives, right? We don't want kids smoking this shit. We don't want everybody high while driving. We have to figure out some way of preventing that. But it seems like, to me, the Republicans have just been very obstinate about this particular issue, despite the fact that most of their own party, I think over 50% of Republicans now, are in favor of legalization. But the old guard just really hasn't, I think, moved along with their party that much on this issue.
I think that fight's lost. I mean, it's gonna take time to play out. But there's a category of things that I think public opinion has settled, and we know the direction of. It's kind of like going back to original things. Like, are you concerned that people are going to walk back the right to interracial marriage, or the right to homosexual sodomy, or like any of these other rights that were come up through substantive due process? And the answer is I don't think there's much of a risk there, because I think we know what the view is as a country of that. Like it's pretty settled. I think marijuana is the same. I think that it's inevitably going to be legalized. It's kind of just a question of when and how. Because I think the poll numbers are clear, and I don't think it's almost impossible to draw a comparison between it and alcohol that doesn't lead to the thought process that you should legalize it.
Yeah.
The question then becomes in the implementation. Like, what are the regulations around it? How is that handled? Which is more complicated. But I would agree with you. I think probably that's just the direction things are going. And then I think the concern for people who are concerned with it is more about what happens next, because the arc of politics has taught me that, like, people say it's a slippery slope fallacy. No, it's a slippery slope certainty. Like, because what you have are people who are activists in an area, and when they have a policy victory, they don't retire. They pick the next policy that they want to go after in that area. And that's why I was saying case by case, because I would be with you on marijuana, but I don't know what the next target is going to be.
Yeah. So I have another question for you. I know I've been asking a lot of questions. So if you ever have a question for me, because you just jump in. I had a panel yesterday, and we talked about, there was a disagreement as to who is in sort of gaining ground, or maybe not gaining ground, because I think we all agree on that, but who is in control of the media sphere in the U.S. Is it more the left or more the right? And a lot of people following the election have said, we need a left-wing Joe Rogan. We need podcasters. That's the counter, but they have lost him to some extent, I think. right? I mean, he did endorse Trump for this
Yeah.
election, and there has been, I think, a shift, at least definitely among the alternative media, which has always sort of been right wing because they've been excluded, I think, from maybe other media organizations. But I mean, the alternative media has become pretty big at this point, right? I mean, Joe Rogan alone is I don't know this for sure, but my guess is he's probably bigger than some
Mhm.
mainstream news networks potentially by himself. And I wonder, where do you think the current, sorry, I just saw a chat that was, quote, I can't wait for the new Joe Rogan to become far right as well. I thought that was funny. But where do you think the current media landscape sits in terms of, who does it favor more?
I think it's decentralized right now. I think certainly if you look at legacy media, that's overwhelmingly favors the left. Um, the question is, how much does legacy media matter anymore? I mean, like, I certainly, I guess I sometimes get access to cable TV for sports or political debates, but typically I don't, and consume a ton of internet media. So, I think there is an open question there, and I think the right has been, generally speaking, more effective in like internet and social media spaces of late. That's not going to last though, because this stuff is cyclical, right? Like I remember, like when Howard Dean and Obama kind of like broke the mold on how to do grassroots fundraising and changed the way that PACs operated as a result, and that was a sea change in politics. And then when we got better internet mailing lists, that was a sea change in politics, and that's why we get these annoying text messages 100 times a day now. I suspect that the left will get better at this over time. That said, there are limits to that. Like, like Brianna Wu is a really good example of this, where by divorcing, obviously she's trans and she has a very pro-trans position, but she's divorcing herself from the extreme position on the left.
Yeah.
And the reason she's doing that in part is that the extreme position is untenable. And it's just not going to win you an election. And it might get you internet popularity, but it's going to be a very narrow corner. It's never going to be a Joe Rogan, right? So if you're trying to either grow as a personality or just do politics effectively, you need to draw some guardrails around that and kind of be very clear about what your like fundamental neutral principles are and stick with them. And I think that's why, I mean, he's a good conversationalist, but someone like Joe Rogan does well because you know what he stands for. You know what his views are. They're not always even right, but he holds them and he holds them genuinely. And then he has these conversations and they feel honest because he's coming into them with this kind of like known position, and his known positions aren't outside the bounds of what's kind of like acceptable in that way. And I think the left hasn't gone through the exercise of drawing boundaries on what is or is not permissible under like the party banner. And the right has its problems there too, but it's pronounced on the left. And until they do, I think this problem is going to be tough to solve. But I'm hopeful. Like I said, I brought up Brianna because I thought what she's doing is exactly what Democrats should be doing right now. And if people followed her lead, they would have more success.
So I'm going to like agree with 99% of what you're saying, but then I'm going to, I guess, maybe bring up a pet peeve that I've noticed. I agree with you that there is a range of political opinions that the Democrats sort of are kind of stuck into defending. I think that the big one that we saw during the last election was the trans surgeries for detained illegal migrants. Right, that was said
Yeah.
during the debate stage, and it seemed so wild that people thought Trump was lying. They just thought he just pulled that out of his ass. Right, it was like another Haitian cat moment.
Yeah.
And it turns out it was entirely accurate, right? On the ACLU forum in 2019, Kamala Harris specifically stated that she would do that. And then she repeated it again in a different interview. And she's never walked it back. And she can't walk it back because if she walks it back, there's consequences for that, right? There's political consequences for that might not show up in a primary, but would definitely show up in a general. So I understand that part, but one of the things that I get a little bit miffed at, and I'm specifically, I mean, I think she is definitely not the only one who does this, but I'm specifically thinking about the most recent Brianna Wu debate that I saw, was that it was the shooting of that CEO. That was the topic that was being discussed of Brian Thompson, and it was all lefties on the panel. There was just sort of like the makeup of the panel. And one of the things I've noticed is that the argument that she used, that I think that I've seen from multiple other people, and almost always seems to happen when you have a panel of just one side, whether it be right wingers or left wingers, is they, instead of debating the actual ethics of the action, they begin debating about the optics of the action, right? And debating about the optics of an action, to me, feels a little bit disingenuous if you're trying to decide whether or not this is right. Because, I mean, do you see what I'm saying? So, like, we're trying to decide whether or not, like, this shooting was, what are the ethical concerns of this shooting? Well, it makes us look bad, so obviously we shouldn't support it. That's the only reason? Is that, because if that's the only reason, now I'm concerned. Now I feel almost like you're lying to me a little bit, that you actually are okay with this, but you want my vote, so you're going to lie to me, and you're going to, like, misrepresent that you actually think that this was a problem when you might not, right? Unless you can articulate some kind of problem. And of course, maybe I'm the worst example. Like, maybe I'm on the entirely other end of the example, because, like, I'll fight with right wingers all the time, and party unity be damned. But I mean, do you ever get that feeling when you see any side be particularly concerned about optics as opposed to arguing the principles about something?
Oh yeah, yeah. But I mean, that's I know it's especially because you put Wix here. This is I'm getting prepared to stop annoying my left-leaning friends and start annoying my right-leaning friends, because my positions don't change based on that sort of political wind. Like, I've changed my views over time, but, like, in terms of things like, should we get rid of the filibuster? No, we shouldn't. And we shouldn't when the Democrats were in power. We shouldn't now. Should we pack the court? No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't pack the court when it's helpful. We shouldn't pack the court when it's hurtful. Like, it's just, if you have a principle, then these sort of things are actually clearer, because you can just apply the principle. Politics is weird, though, because politics is about winning, right? Like, if you don't win, it doesn't really matter what your principles or policies were, because you don't get to implement them. And that's, in some senses, like, I hear what you're saying, but that's the best argument for Trump, right? Where it's like, I love his displayed personality? No. Do I think his policies should be implemented uniformly, at least his stated policies? No. Do I think that, but if you were a right to lifer, you were faced with this exact decision, right? You were saying,
Yeah.
God, is this guy actually Christian? Clearly not. Is this guy actually a believer? Clearly not. Is this guy actually, like, does he even really care about the abortion issue particularly? I don't think so. But he might deliver this win, right? And that was the deal with the devil that was made. So yeah, it's a cynical way of approaching politics and discourse, but I can hardly say that's a one side.
Oh,
issue,
100%. Yeah, I'm definitely not saying it's a one side issue.
Even my friends who were voting for Harris, they tried at first to be like, "Oh, I'm so enthusiastic. I'm coconut pilled. I'm into this," and I'm like, and like 3 weeks later, like, "Well, she's better than Trump." I'm like, okay, so, like, now we're being honest, right? Like, and that's fine. Like, but that is what it is. Like, sometimes politics is just making decisions between undesirable outcomes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It happens on both sides. I think that I think it happened. People will do it that I like, and that I think that perhaps it's true. I think it is true that Brianna Wu probably does dislike the shooting on principle, on a number of principles, but still found the optics argument to be more persuasive to that group of people that she was interacting with. And I think that still sort of, I guess, says that the optics question is very important, or more important for people that could potentially backfire. And I'm going to go back to the Her Report debate that I had, because in the just the manic sort of desire to prevent the optics of Biden being what he was at that point, just the denial, the, oh, look, he looks good here, he looks good there. We can't let him be sold as having the kind of decline that he had. I mean, the Democrats kind of shot themselves in the foot. I think a non-optics oriented conversation then would have been better for them, because they would have been like, look, optics aside, this report's a problem. Maybe we should have an open primary.
Yeah, I was explaining to a friend of mine earlier where I was like, one of the crazy things about this last election was that Harris had an authenticity problem, and she was running against the most prolific liar I've ever seen. Like, you know what I mean? So, like, what do you think about that? Like, both things were true simultaneously. Like, you can be someone who habitually just says whatever is useful in that moment, and that's Trump's hallmark, right? Like, the best argument about the tariffs is that he doesn't want to do them. He just wants to destabilize people for future negotiations.
God, I hope he doesn't want to do it.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's not. I think you and I both know, because we've been involved in this kind of situation. That's not an uncommon negotiation tactic. People will take extreme positions to destabilize a conversation to try to hammer out a better deal. But it's not about saying what's true. And that's certainly, it is a real phenomenon that people do that. That said, it happens because it's rewarded, right? And despite all his, I'm not going to get into them because there's so many, but despite his fabrications, when he did the podcast tour towards the end of the election, he came across as an approachable guy who could sit there and talk openly about things, and sometimes his answers you liked and sometimes they didn't. But I think I told you earlier that kind of aside he had with Rogan about this being his last election was, while ultimately it did not sway me to vote for him, it was probably the most impactful thing that happened in the entire election cycle in terms of moving my vote. Because, like, oh, well, I think, like we said earlier, I was worried about what I considered to be a probability that he does something catastrophic. And that statement really lowered what I thought the risk was meaningfully. Whereas, with Harris, I never felt like I felt like it was all optics. I never felt like I understood what she believed.
Yeah.
And as a result, I had no reason to think she wouldn't do what the Democratic establishment wanted to do. And I was pretty sure I didn't want that to happen. So, it's crazy. But yeah, she was, to me, the less authentic candidate, which is what not an outcome I would have predicted.
No, the authenticity problem, I think, was persistent. I think and it really did feel, again, like the media was just so hyper focused on optics, and the question the question she couldn't answer about the trans inmates thing, again, because of the optics. The abortion, conversation was something that nobody talked about and was denied multiple times during the debates, that it just simply is true. Tim Walz, did sign a bill that allowed abortion up until birth, and I think JD challenged that like once, and that was just sort of hand waved. And whenever the conversation came up, that was hand waved, because that wasn't the conversation that they wanted to be had. To be fair, Trump did do that at the debate once as well. I think he was asked, "Would you sign a bill that would ban abortion?" And he answered later, after the debate was over. But at the time of the debate, he didn't answer, and he was flailing a little bit and trying to dodge the question, and that felt a little bit inauthentic for him, especially.
Oh yeah, for sure. Look, you want to talk about like inauthentic, and this is a backhanded compliment, because J.D. Vance was, in my opinion, by far the best communicator on either side. I think he
100%.
He outstripped everybody in the competition pretty quickly. And part of the interesting story about this was I remember early on this being told that like Walz was going to be a real problem for Vance in like a debate or in a head-to-head, and it's like that. Wow, that was a bill of goods. But when Vance was asked to defend, Trump's election denial, his answers were not. It's the only time he struggled,
He
and
dodged, yeah.
He's such a good communicator. The reason he was struggling is that there's nothing good to say. Like there's no good answer you're allowed to say because it's a shame he walked this back. Trump had that. I forgot which podcast it was. He had this one moment where he admitted he lost, and then later he walked it back later. But he did. He did admit he lost in one of those interviews because they're rambling and they're hours long, and you kind of lose your talking points eventually. And it's a shame that he didn't. It would have been nice if he had allowed that to be the party platform, but I think that's the nature of the beast. And I think if we have more and more elections decided by social media, being able to project that type of authenticity rather than like talking head flowchart debate style authenticity is going to become increasingly important for candidates. And that's going to favor people like Bernie, who was great on Rogan, for the record. I was never a Bernie fan. And when I heard him on Rogan, I was like, oh, this is a guy who's deeply committed to his principles. Like I can kind of understand why people like this guy. So hopefully both sides get the memo and we start seeing candidates who are skilled in long form conversation and can really express who they are and what they believe.
You think Kamala should have gone on Rogan?
I think that was an unwinnable scenario for her.
Sure.
I think it was a brilliant gambit by the Trump campaign because if she goes, it's going to be a train wreck, and if she doesn't go, it's a different kind of train wreck. It was really, really well played. That last podcast tour was a brilliant political move, and this is the thing about Trump. Like I voiced criticisms of him a number of times today. If the Democrats ran somebody with a fifth of his political instinct, they would have won. But his political instinct is vast. Like, he has a real uncanny knack for understanding how things are going to play out and what the reaction to the reaction is going to be, and making that work to his advantage. It's a real political talent.
No, 100%. Well, so Ryan, I mean, I've kept you here for we've been talking for a little bit over 2 hours. I mean, I don't want to keep you too much longer if you've got things to do. I mean, do you want to move to closings? Do you have any final or any other thoughts? Any questions?
Yeah, I had one kind of question/topic for you. We didn't get to. We covered most of the stuff I wanted to, so I was happy to let you ask the questions. One of the things that made me think I should start jumping on these panels and talking to people was my increasing dismay with the way that law is discussed and reported. Specifically, no one cares about what the law says. They want the outcome they want. It's good news if the court does what you want. It's bad news if the court doesn't do what you want. You lose. There's a motion to dismiss is denied, and it's touted as a big victory, even though the case is continuing, because nobody cares. And I was trying to think, like, God, what could be done to improve the state of legal discourse in our society or in our circles or in some tiny portion of the internet even. Specifically thinking, the comment that made me think about it was that we don't have this kind of like class of lawyers coming out there and defending constitutional principles, free speech, freedom of religion for their own sake. It seems like everyone's a talking head. And what they're doing is they're coming out and they're saying, like, these are my politics, and I happen to be a lawyer, and that gives me credibility to make my argument, rather than I am a lawyer, and what I'm here to do is explain to you how the legal principles would operate in this situation. And I have politics, but what I'm really trying to do is be helpful and explain to you what makes the country work the way it does and why that's good. And I don't know how to get there. Like, I feel like it's you get so much more traction for being extreme that coming out and being thoughtful and moderate and trying to be pedagogical on some level. It just doesn't seem to have a place. I don't know if you've thought about this, but like, how do you think about trying to improve the state of legal discourse?
Yeah. So no, I've thought about this, and the way because I'm a very political person generally, and yes, like I'm a lawyer. That's my profession. But in terms of the things that I like to talk about, I like to talk about the politics, different philosophical positions, first principles. What are the outcomes of X, Y, Z? Those are things that really interest me. And I think what's important is to, yes, you can use your legal knowledge to like explain perhaps like a point,
Mhm.
but I think you have to make it clear, and I try to do this. For example, I'll be on a panel and then I will say, I will say things like, look, leaving my politics aside for a second, okay? This is what's being alleged, and I'll explain what's going on. And I do my best to explain it in the most neutral way possible.
Mhm.
Even if it's like opposed, I'll give like the legal argument against my side, right? I'll say like, this is what they're putting forward, this is what they're arguing, and then I'll finish that, and then I'll say, okay, now here's why I disagree with it. Um, I'm concerned that perhaps people don't, and maybe I could always do it more. Maybe I should do it more, but I think that's a way to help solve it. I think it's a way to help solve it is sort of like to take a break and pull yourself out of the froth mouth kind of debate mode, and say, let's leave aside my personal opinions here for a second. This is what I think the law is, and this is why I think it is what it is. And then once that sort of education moment has passed, then
Mhm.
get back to the argument, because the reality is, like, I know that we're going to be more nerds about this than the common person, and there's
Mhm.
no way around that, because you know this is the thing that we chose to go into as a profession. Most people they're more interested in just the politics of things, and because anybody can have an opinion about that. That doesn't require any kind of expertise. It doesn't require necessarily reading, although sometimes it should. Okay, but it doesn't require it, right? And so people, it's fun to be able to jump on and see like different arguments and see different opinions. I think that separating and mixing in legal education with that is probably the best way to go, as opposed to as opposed to not keeping them separate and just sort of
Mhm.
having them constantly mixed and constantly pushed. This political like controversy. This is the legal correct way to think about things, and I'm asserting this because of my authority. That's not good. I also I'm a little bit. I think this has happened with Legal Eagle to some extent, which is I think that there is the common concern of audience capture. Look, you know as well as I do that if I'm hiring an expert, I kind of already know what that expert's going to say.
Yeah, or
And
we'll get a new expert. Yeah.
yeah, or you get a new expert, and you can find
Yeah.
and the expert. Look, I'm not saying this, but hypothetically, an expert would perhaps know, if they have some inkling of what side they think the person's talking to them is
Mhm.
on. Perhaps, not any expert that I would ever hire, because but some experts probably would perhaps change their opinion to fit the kind of opinion that they think the person's looking
Mhm.
for in order to get the money. And I'm concerned about audience capture generally, and I think that's a real thing when it comes to bigger attorneys and or attorneys who have a large presence on the internet. Now, I'm a small fry, and a lot of us that a lot of people I interact with are, and my income comes primarily from my job, which is entirely separate, entirely divorced from like my internet kind of hobby, kind of personality thing that I do. And I think that lets me be a little bit more separated than perhaps it would if my entire income was dependent on maintaining a certain viewer base. I'd like to think that I'd be unbiased, but
Mhm.
like almost everybody who likes to think they would be unbiased, the actual challenge comes when like your livelihood is now threatened with being unbiased.
Yeah.
Now it's difficult. Now the actual decision comes. And I would like to think that I'd be able to resist that. But I know that a lot of people are not able to resist that, and it's possible that I wouldn't. I don't know. So audience capture, I think, is a big issue, and then also maybe a way to avoid that would be try
Mhm.
as much as possible to mix in legal education, but also keep it separate.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, because I mean, audience capture is ever-present danger, and you can think of tons of examples of that. And then maybe if there's some way just to highlight like actual credibility enhancing positions. Like I know we Wix here. We were on one of his panels. So a good example is the filibuster slash free speech stuff. You know, where it's like, okay, like if you really support those things, then your views on them shouldn't change depending on who's in power and is trying to trample on them, because you support the principle,
Right.
not the party that's you trying to weaponize it or destroy it, right? Um, and I think it's a mark of integrity when you can find somebody who admits that their principles require them to reach a conclusion that is not their preference.
That's originalism.
Now, yeah, if they're thoughtful, that shouldn't happen that often because like your principles should be good, meaning they should lead to outcomes that you like more often than not, but not always. And sometimes there's an outcome that you don't love. And I'm hoping that people will resonate to that. But I think that's too subtle a point on some level, because you're competing with, the internet freak show. And
Yeah.
that's there's some real attention getting stuff out there.
There is, and I think this is a general issue with the media as well. And I think you see a massive spike in, in social attitudes changing, but also, an increase in depression and social anxiety and just overall anxiety following, 2014 when social media starts taking off. And I think one of the reasons for that is, social media, but media generally, but especially social media, really emphasizes, reaction. It really emphasizes controversy, and if you can find controversy in where it doesn't exist, you can make a story, and if you can make a story, you can make money. So yeah, I think that there's a major concern there. But I mean, fighting against that, I think, is good luck. I mean,
Well, that's the problem. If you're inclined to fight against that, you don't have the reach to fight against it, right? Because by the
true.
time you got a big network, you already lost. You already gave up that fight. At least that seems to be universally true.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what do you think about the one? And people might fight me on this. Joe Rogan might be a little bit of a difference on maybe an exception to this because I mean he'll disagree with people he brings on, right? And he'll have a full conversations. I mean, do you think that he's captured?
I think the argument that he's captured is getting better, not worse.
Okay.
But I think historically, I would say no. Um, Now, that's a tough one though, because I think that it's a little bit like Bill Maher on some level. Like
I like
this
him.
is somebody who has fairly well defined personal principles, and those personal principles no longer align with the Democratic Party, which they historically did. And there's real tension there. So I don't want to attribute that to audience capture, because I think that there actually is a real significant change in the extent to which the Democratic Party embodies those kind of principles that has alienated people. That said, I think it's Joe's gone from a Bernie left to a libertarian centrist to a more classic right over time. But in part, that's because the right's been moving. The right is not the neocons and anymore. Like the kind of right populism that Trump embodies, if you take him at his word, is appealing to someone like Joe, I think. And the best argument to the contrary is that you shouldn't believe him, right? Which is fair enough. I've harped on many reasons why that's a reasonable thing not to believe in this conversation. But the difference between me and Joe is that Joe talked to him, right? Joe knows him. So his read on whether or not to believe him is probably better than mine.
I think Joe's the example I thought of, but Bill Maher is a great example. Bill Maher, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but I think Bill Maher has a principle streak that is more prevalent than on any other talk show host I can think of, like left leaning talk show host I can think of.
Mhm.
I mean, he's far more objective than I think maybe the one person that might be a challenge to that is Jon Stewart. I think Jon Stewart and Bill Maher are like, yes, Jon Stewart's politics are left, but they've been
Yeah.
pretty consistent over time, and he does seem to come from a position of principle when he argues those. Bill Maher, I think, is also principled, and he'll argue his principles, even when they don't align with his party, and he'll support his party. I mean, he has. I mean, he gave Hillary Clinton like $1 million. He gave Obama $1 million. I think he gave Biden $1 million too. I'm not sure about that one, but he's been generally supportive of the Democratic Party, but he'll fight him, and he'll fight him on issues that he disagrees with, and he'll bring anybody onto his show. I think it was it may have been Milo Yiannopoulos who said, like, during his interview with Bill Maher, he said, you're the only good one left, and
Yeah.
I, to some extent, that might be true. Like the other talk show hosts, it's just I can't watch them. They're just babble. Bill Maher I can
Well,
watch.
I think that he's a great example because he'll go on any platform that's big enough to be useful to him, and he'll go on Fox. He'll have on Ben Shapiro and Bannon, and they'll hash it out. And I disagree with him, and sometimes when he sometimes I'm like, God, why are you asking that question?
Yeah.
There's so much more interesting to talk about. But I trust him because he takes positions that are not expedient for him. Like, I think there are times where, to your point about audience capture, it would have been easier for him to zig, and he zagged. And that makes me think, not that he's right, but that his opinions are honestly held. And I think that that's something that people like about Rogan. Like, you might think he's wrong, but you don't think he's lying. You think his opinions are honestly held. And that is a big deal. And look, I mean, I think, like, I'm not an AOC fan, but for the people who love AOC on the left, I think that's part of her appeal too, is that she's good at projecting sincerity.
Definitely with Bernie Sanders too. I mean, Bernie Sanders, you look at his positions in the 80s, and they are essentially what they are today. And he's been passionately arguing about it the whole time. You can't call him a liar, right? I think you can call Kamala Harris disingenuous. I think you could probably say that about Biden to some extent. I don't think you can say it about Bernie. I just don't.
And if you look at elections recently, I think there's very good evidence for this. Like, sincerity and kind of like projecting authenticity is not exactly Hillary Clinton's. That's not her strong suit. Biden, when he won, was very good at that. He had this anti-Trump narrative. He had this, the concerns about Charlottesville, which I could pick at that, but I don't think that he thinks it's a hoax. I think that he believes what he's saying, and his decline was such that in the last election he wasn't able to do that, and Harris certainly wasn't able to do that. So, authenticity has projected the winner of the last few presidential elections. So, I mean, maybe that's the takeaway. That's the metric. Next election cycle, put your money on the person who's better at projecting authenticity through the various mediums that are available.
Yeah. No, and to some extent, I like that authenticity is and sort of long form conversations are sort of becoming in vogue. I think that's healthy. We like to be kind of doomerish, and there's definitely things you can look to when it comes to like the doomer nature of society. But I think there's some glimmers of hope, and I think that's one of them. That Charlottesville stuff that pissed me off. So like they kept saying, but
I'm not gonna try to convince anybody because we've been litigating that forever. I would just say, if you have not read the transcript, you should just read the transcript.
Yes,
and the transcript does not like make Trump look like a sane, normal, rational, blameless individual. He reads like he reads, but you can ask yourself some questions about what he said and didn't say over the course of that transcript. So I would just encourage people to read it for yourself. And unfortunately, that's the exhausting state of media today, where it's gotten to the point where I see something pop up on a feed, and then I have to read like 3 or 4 sources before I can confidently say anything about it, because otherwise I'm just going to make an ass out of myself. Like when Pelosi's husband got attacked. right? Like there was an actual, like I think it was an ABC outlet that reported that this was like all these kind of like indicia that this was a gay love affair.
Yeah.
It wasn't even like a social media hoax. It was an actual media outlet. I read the story, was like, oh my God, that's a big deal, and texted a friend about it. And then by the time he read my text, that had been rescinded, and then he texted back like, "You're an idiot. What's the matter with you?" And it's like, okay, that's on me. I think that there's a lesson there. Like you need to take the news a little bit more slowly. If you're reacting at lightning speed, you're going to be wrong a lot. And if you care about being
100%.
right, you need to give it a second and let it develop.
100%. I think, and I don't know your thoughts on this, but that, I mean, I think really exemplifies one of my issues with the BLM protests and riots that we saw,
Mhm.
which was, there wasn't there wasn't the investigation didn't conclude yet before you had the reaction, and the punishment wasn't doled out before you had the reaction, and everything wasn't
Mhm.
done yet. Same thing with Kyle Rittenhouse, right? I mean, these judgments were made before people saw anything, before people even knew what happened. The judgment was made, and I think it's just I know everybody does it, but it's irresponsible, and we should be doing our best to not do it at
Yeah.
all times.
Louis C.K. told this crazy story about being in Fox News, and it's not only Fox News that does this, but in his examples about Fox. And Obama was giving a speech, and the rebuttal, like Obama's an idiot, everything he said is wrong, speech was being prepared and rehearsed, but Obama's speech was still happening. Right, so they're writing the rebuttal, but the speech isn't over, And I think that that is the sentiment that got us to this place, right? Where you're like, in order to get clicks and views, you need to be first and you need to be attention getting. So you're going to give a hot take without having any idea what happened. And if we could find some way to convince people to digest news a little bit more slowly, like read it in the morning, newspaper style, like even that, just 24 hours before you form an opinion would take down the temperature tremendously. But I don't pretend to know how to unring that bell. And if anyone has any ideas, please shoot them my way because I would love to get on board that project.
I think it's just as this, we can only do what we can do as just an individual in a very large country, which is, hey man, are you sure about that? You want to wait a few seconds before you make that claim? Just do our best to push the kind of culture that we want to see develop.
Well, and it's funny how much I know this has been the theme of the conversation, but if you have like fundamental neutral principles, how often that gets in the way. And it doesn't make you flawless, like you're going to make mistakes, but like, okay, well, my barrier for rioting is kind of high. Like it would take a lot. It's not impossible, but it would take a lot. And if you have kind of these guardrails in place, you're less likely to overreact quickly because you have reasons not to. But I do think that those are on all levels being attacked, both culturally and within the government. So, part of my love for the work that Wick does is that he's very consistent in saying that these are like what we need to be supporting is the guardrails, and I think that that's something that we could all do better. But I don't know how to make people click on it.
No, I agree. I think Wick is an example, and I don't even think he's in the chat anymore, so I can say this without feeling like I'm glazing him. I think Wick is a good example of a somebody who is, I think, actually, hey, this is a good principle. We should stick by it, and I think I respect it. I think
Yeah,
sometimes it has like clout consequences, but I respect it a lot. So, I have one final question for you.
sure.
Let's imagine January 6th never happened. Like the Ace
Mhm.
memo never happened. That whole situation didn't happen. You still had Trump saying like, "Oh, they rigged it. It was all stolen and everything," but nothing. He didn't actually do anything about it. Nothing ever. There was no actual. Nothing was put in
No
motion.
Georgia call, no false slate of
No,
electors.
no, no false. None of that. But just
Yeah.
and then he's just basically bitching and moaning, and then January 20th comes around, and then he just leaves, right? And that's just what happens. Do you vote for Donald Trump in 2024? If that happened,
Yes.
yeah. That
Yeah.
was that was the kind of the key thing that disqualified him for you.
Yeah, because the problem with that is that it has a a weight that's hard to weigh against other things. Like I could weigh like I don't like his tariff policy, but what's the chance he's going to do that? Versus like I don't like the left border policy, but what's the chance that they're like those are all kind of like calculuses that are easy to perform. The election stuff was disqualifying on a kind of like a different axis, and it raises questions about his responsibility and actions when now that he has power again. Now, I like I said, there were things he did that partially rehabilitated him in my mind. But yeah, that was the issue. And again, like I'm not a Jan 6 is an insurrection. That's not a that I don't have a strong opinion on that because I haven't really gone down that road. But the actual election related stuff I thought was deeply problematic for me. But for all the reasons we've said, I'm rooting for him. Like I really do think this is a once in a generation moment for a systemic overhaul. And if he has his priorities straight and can land the plane on even half of some of the ambitious goals they've set out, it would be a generational presidency. So, I'm rooting for him. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we covered a lot of good ground. Do you have any final thoughts, any kind of closing, anything like that?
No, I mean, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you having me on. It's not a debate, so I don't really need to, do any parting shots, but you can, if you're so inclined, you can follow me on X, Ryan C. Mullally. My first name's my real name. And yeah, this has been fantastic. We should do this more.
Absolutely, and seriously, follow him on Twitter. You can if you have issues finding him, you can find him through my Twitter as well. I've got him linked there. So, and basically my last post. So check him out. I've a lot of agreeable shit in this discussion. I think we covered a lot of good ground. I think one of the things that I think is just so helpful is when you're having a conversation with somebody who definitely is trying to understand you and as opposed to just fight you. They're actually trying to understand your position. And I think that you've been very good at exemplifying that this conversation, and I hope I have as well. So until next time, and maybe next time we'll be on a some kind of panel debate, and it'll get heated, and it just is what it is. But we know at least that we can have these kind of conversations too, and I think that's a skill that everybody should have.
And I think what's interesting about this sort of conversation is that we agree. Like if you took like some data on what we agree on and disagreed on in this conversation, it's going to be like 90 plus.
Yeah.
Agree. But in a kind of like friendly conversation, you can air out and figure out what the points of disagreement are. And in some sense, they almost become the focal point sometimes, but that's not because it's like a hostile conversation. It's because when you agree on a lot, it's interesting to talk about where you differ. And, I very much appreciate your candor because when you put out that post about Trump, I was like, man, I really would like to see how he landed the plane on that. Because, that was a tough one for me that I was really weighing. And I think I do kind of understand where you're coming from now.
It was a tough one for me too. And a lot of people just sort of cynically took it as, oh, we knew that was coming from you. But like, I assure you, you really didn't. Like, it was a tough one for me. But for all the reasons we talked about, I think the calculation just, pushed it over the edge. And, I said, look, here's where we're at. It's decision time. And, and then I rolled with it. So.
Yeah. And look, man, you live in a swing state. I don't. So,
see, if I didn't, I knew. Yeah. But.
Yeah, I have to admit that's the one factor we didn't talk about is I knew my vote didn't matter very much. So that, was certainly part of my cowardice there.
No, look, if I didn't live in a swing state, I mean, if you don't live, I think I even said, if you don't live in a swing state, like just vote third party. Who cares, right? Mm-hmm. But if you live in a swing state, oh shit! Now I actually got to think about this shit, and it's fuck.
Yeah, well, lesson learned. Even the swing states, even the safe states weren't that safe this time. True. I think what's the one's coming to mind? Like New Jersey is like deep blue, and it was only like +5. So who knows?
New Jersey. I think Virginia was also like, I think it went blue, but it was like for a while there, it was like, I don't know, like that was getting pretty close for a second.
That's crazy. Yeah. Anyway, man, I really appreciate it, and hope we can do this again.
Absolutely. Have a good night.
You too. Cheers.
Cheers. What a cool guy. That is I like him. I like Ryan. Yeah, if you haven't checked him out, just go on Twitter. He's I can probably I'm gonna put his Twitter in the chat as well. Make it real easy for you guys just to go give him a follow. Definitely a principled dude, at least based on the conversation I had, and hopefully it was you guys enjoyed the conversation and it was interesting and delved into a lot of different topics. And I hope I was able to exemplify some of my beliefs as well, because I do a lot of debates, but kind of these long form conversations where you really delve into your own beliefs and kind of laying them out, for people to hear. I think kind of helps give people more of an understanding of, oh, this is in the future, like on some, because there's never enough time in these panel debates to really get into like the foundations. Besides maybe sometimes prime debates, and usually Scott's getting into those ones anyway. So and so I think things like this are good, are good to have. So I'll be posting this whole thing on YouTube. You guys will be able to find it, and um, yeah, I hope I hope I don't fall down. I think the trap that some some people are falling down, where they're becoming hyper partisan, hyper, and some people that I really like, that's kind of their thing. It's part of the sort of like WrestleMania kind of, like Gibbs. Yes, that's what he does, but he's never changed, right? That's just how he operates. But there's been other streamers, I think, that have sort of fallen down the route of, I'm going to be objective, I'm going to be objective, I'm going to be objective, and then then they lose an election, and now it's or even elections coming up even, and then like shit changes, and it's upsetting sometimes. But I do my best to not fall down that road, and call me out if I do. Anyway, hold on, I'm gonna post his Twitter. I'm gonna post his Twitter in chat real quick. Give me a second. There you go. Give him a follow. And if you haven't given me a follow, please consider giving me a follow. You could find me here if you're watching this. You can also find me on my Twitter, which is also the same, Lactoid TV, or my YouTube, which is also the same, Lactoid TV. And for all of you who gave bit subs or simply active in chat, thank you so much. Appreciate all you guys. We're gonna raid on out though. Yeah, thank you, Grumble. I appreciate that. So that's my X.com. I don't like the name X, but fuck, I mean it is what it is. I'm gonna keep saying Twitter until I get sued, or no, I'm gonna keep saying Twitter until I get threatened to get sued if I continue to say Twitter, and then I'm gonna stop using, because yeah, fuck that. Anyway, so who should we rate? Yeah, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, everybody. Have a great weekend. You know what? Wick is streaming. Speaking of, we're gonna raid on out into Wick. That's what we're gonna do.
No impact on my own values, who didn't matter to me.